Hi, I'm Peter Cowie. And so to the soothing strains of Schumann's Piano Quintet in E-flat major, we begin what many people regard as Ingmar Bergman's magnum opus, the crowning achievement of a career that began in 1944 when he served as an assistant on Torment, and that would ostensibly end in 1982, the year in which this picture, Fanny and Alexander, was made. Of course, his career didn't end then. Bergman went on to direct several productions for the theatre. He went on to write screenplays that were brought to the cinema by Billy August and Liv Ullmann, and to make television dramas himself. Even as late as 2003, at the age of 85, he made the well-received Saraband for Swedish television. But I think Fanny and Alexander represents a summing up of his life. It adumbrates so many of the themes we know from the breakthrough Bergman films of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But it's also a coming to terms with himself for Bergman. And he begins, as he does when he's in a genial mood, by going back to his childhood. Here is his alter ego, played by Bertil Guver. An alter ego for Bergman because he himself used to go up to Uppsala, where this film is set, to stay in an apartment that looked very much like this. It was owned by his grandmother and included no fewer than 14 rooms. He would be left on his own, and he would absorb this decor, and his imagination would take flight. And out of this interplay of fantasy and almost oppressively furnished rooms emerges, I think, Bergman's love for the theatre and the mystery that lies behind this elaborate set, a home that seems for a moment to have been abandoned by all its occupants. Here, Alexander is passing through the door that divides his parents' section of the apartment from the rooms still used by his grandmother. And he prowls around the exotic terrain, rather like the little boy who explores the hotel in the silence. Bertil Guver was only 11 when he made this film. Bergman chose him out of many, many applicants for the part. And on the Criterion box set of Fanny and Alexander, you'll find an interview with him as he is today. I visited the set of Fanny and Alexander in 1982, and Guver was remarkably self-assured for his age, standing around waiting for another take, as one does on film sets, that endless waiting, and must have been a cheerful soul with whom Bergman could identify and enjoy this journey back into the past. Bergman told us with a laugh that when Bertil had been asked if he'd ever got into any kind of memorable mischief, he replied, "Yes, I scared my grandpa to death." Like Alexander, Bergman would sit under the dining table, in his own words, quote, "listening to the sunshine that came in through the windows," unquote. Bergman has been at pains to show the difference between the film and his own childhood, however. It's simply, he says, quote, "the story of a middle-class, perhaps upper-middle-class family, sticking closely together and set in a medium-sized Swedish town in 1910, unquote. Bergman did have a younger sister named Margareta, just as Alexander has his sister, Fanny. He also had an elder brother named Dag, who was quite domineering and eventually became a Swedish ambassador. And now will come an incident that Bergman recalls from his earliest years. As the statue suddenly and unmistakably moves. "It was a kind of secret terror that I recognized again in Cocteau's Blood of a Poet," he told Jørn Donner in an interview. "It's rather like the appearance of death in The Seventh Seal, isn't it, when he appears on the seashore and you instinctively believe in him, even though you know rationally that this could not be death."
Alexander? Hur är det?
Even for a man who had directed some 40 films in 4 decades, Fanny and Alexander was an immense undertaking, particularly by Swedish standards. Bergman insisted on a full 5-hour version to be aired on television over a number of nights. So his financier of the time, British mogul Lou Grade, who had put up money for Autumn Sonata and From the Life of the Marionettes, now drew back, especially as those 2 films had not done well at the box office. So Jörn Donner, a Finnish friend of Bergman's who was then head of the Swedish Film Institute, had to scurry around to raise the money. He did so by involving the French company Gaumont and ZDF Television in Germany, as well as Swedish television. But it was a huge undertaking, and for Bergman it marked a grand finale. Here was a film that cost $6 to $7 million in 1982. Very modest by American standards, but by art house standards in Europe in the early 80s, a lot of money. There were 60 speaking parts, over 1,200 extras were involved, and Bergman took over the new sound stages at the Swedish Film Institute in Stockholm, as well as working on location, particularly in Uppsala. Shooting ran to 130 days. Everything was meticulously calculated in advance. Even the temperature on the sound stages was kept at 64 degrees Fahrenheit, Bergman's ideal temperature, so that the technicians and actors could work in reasonable conditions. Shooting began on a Tuesday because, as Bergman says, some catastrophe always happens over the weekend, then you have Monday to fix it. It also marked a significant return to Sweden for Bergman. The film was actually the first he had made in his native country for several years. During the mid-70s, he had fallen foul of the Swedish tax authorities and had spent 4 years in exile in Munich, Germany. There he was a director at the Residenztheater, and there he made From the Life of the Marionettes, a film that revealed his extreme depression. But the Swedish IRS had to eat humble pie and exonerated Bergman from all charges of tax fraud, admitting in public that it had been overzealous in pursuing Sweden's most famous son.
Alida kan gå in till de andra flickorna.
Tack, fruktar.
But I think the joyous mood of most of Fanny and Alexander, there are dark moments, but the joyous mood of most of it, was almost a response to his being accepted again in his homeland. He was being welcomed back, and he took the opportunity of recruiting nearly everyone with whom he'd worked over the years, with, I suppose, the notable exceptions of Max von Sydow, Liv Ullmann and Bibi Andersson. But nearly all the big names in Swedish film and theatre are here. This, for example, is Gun Wollgren, playing Helena Ekdahl, Alexander's granny. Gun Wollgren had made her name during the 40s in numerous Swedish films, and she would pass away just after Fanny and Alexander was released. Bergman was raised in this bourgeois, upper-middle-class atmosphere, where servants were the norm, servants who remained with the family for many, many years. The cinematography is by Sven Nykvist, Bergman's habitual cameraman. He won an Oscar for his work on this film. We can begin to note how classical Bergman's filmmaking is. Blade Runner was made in 1982 also, but it's light years away from Fanny and Alexander in style and approach. This is a classical kind of filmmaking more akin to The Godfather, a style that doesn't date because it's very direct, with very few special effects, an astute use of long lenses, and cutting only when necessary. Bergman will show us the traditional nativity play, which is presented according to his screenplay at 1 p.m. on Christmas Eve, with all the prominent townsfolk in attendance.
Ett hastigt bud ifrån din skapare, o Gud.
Eva Fröling, who's reciting on stage in this shot, was a new face in Bergman's world. Everyone thought she would become the big star of Swedish cinema. It never quite happened, but she responded to Bergman's charisma and gave a wonderfully compelling performance in the lead here. As Bergman has said, she has the look and presence of a queen.
Pris ske Gud uppå hans tron, som skyddar så min ende son.
And the man playing Joseph is Allan Edwall, the father figure in this theatrical family in Uppsala. It's a troupe of players who know each other intimately. And if you've seen The Naked Knight, you'll remember the importance Bergman gives to a circus and its family atmosphere. The same in The Magician, where the entertainers must work for their living.
Räddad är Guds son förvisst. Räddad är vår Jesus Krist.
It always amuses me when I go to Sweden and find that Bergman is regarded, by older Swedes at any rate, as a stage director rather than a director for the screen. "You fellows from abroad don't understand Swedish," one of them told me years and years ago. The subtitles disguise the often banal quality of Bergman's dialogue in the cinema, or words to that effect. Of course, the distinction between Bergman's work for the theatre and his work for the screen may well be simply this, that on stage he is invariably directing someone else's play, while on screen he's directing from his own script. During the past 30 years, I've only seen 9 Bergman stage productions, but each and every one of them has been visually arresting and passionately acted. Erland Josephson, who was once sent to London to supervise a Bergman production, told me that the performance never deviated by so much as a minute in length, and if it did, Ingmar would be furious. Now it's over, and everybody is getting ready to celebrate. In most of continental Europe, the big Christmas binge takes place during the evening of December 24th, not on the 25th, as in the US, Canada, and Britain. We'll talk about the actors more, but this is Jarl Kulle, who enjoyed his greatest role for Bergman, I think, as the arrogant Count Malcolm in Smiles of a Summer Night. As Gustav Adolf, the brother of theatre owner Oscar Ekdahl, he has a lot to say at certain key moments of Fanny and Alexander. He expounds the hedonistic philosophy that Bergman has always liked as a kind of shield to ward off the gloom and doom with which he's usually associated. Kulle is the spirit of life and lustiness, a restaurateur who, as Bergman has quipped, may satisfy the public more with his material edification than Oscar does with his more intellectual nourishment. We're introduced here to Oscar Ekdahl's younger brother, Carl, whose unhappy marriage has led him to the bottle, or vice versa. He and his pals are wearing white hats that they have kept in closets ever since they left college. Traditionally, these white caps are given out to graduating students at Uppsala University, and on May 1st they run down to the river and celebrate. As the years pass, so the caps turn from white to ivory, and from ivory to cream, and they're brought out on special occasions, but traditionally only on May 1st.
So, come here.
But Carl, as we'll see, is not exactly your orthodox Swede. Uppsala, incidentally, is a city of more than 175,000 people, and it lies some 40 miles northwest of Stockholm. The university I mentioned is one of the oldest in Europe, dating from 1477. Downstairs, meanwhile, Gustav Adolf is bearing in the flaming punch bowl, which will be drunk ritually by the actors, theatre staff, and the family. Bergman describes him as beaming with goodwill and high blood pressure, and the makeup crew have done a great job in suggesting exactly that. What Bergman's describing here is a way of life that began to disappear during his own youth. He was born in 1918, and when he was in his early teens, the Social Democratic Party won power in Sweden. The Social Democrats would transform the country, introducing a system of social welfare that became the envy of many nations. And although in the past 15 years or so Sweden has had to tighten its belt economically, it still has an egalitarian flavour that's accepted by its citizens. This is Bergman, talking to us through the mouth of Alan Edwall. He has always maintained that the theatre was his first love, and I don't think that has really changed. It's interesting that after Fanny and Alexander, Bergman kept away from the commercial cinema, but he continued to work almost unceasingly in the theatre in Stockholm. I think it's the atmosphere that he likes, the feeling of camaraderie that Alan Edwall is articulating here.
Det att jag älskar den här lilla världen. Innanför det här husets tjocka murar.
And his choice of close-up is emphatic, at once isolating Oscar Ekdahl from his large audience, but also obliging us, the film audience, to hang on his every word.
Där ute finns den stora världen och ibland lyckas den lilla världen spegla den stora världen så att vi...
Fanny and Alexander was conceived in the dark days of 1978, when Bergman must have wondered if he'd ever be able to return to Stockholm without being arrested by the tax authorities. Then two things occurred. Autumn Sonata, starring Ingrid Bergman and Liv Ullmann, opened to excellent reviews and respectable business in Scandinavia. And Bergman was publicly cleared of defrauding the tax authorities through his Swiss company Persona AG. So the dark side of Fanny and Alexander, which often seems on the verge of prevailing, stems from 1978, and the lighter, lustier and comic aspects of the film emerged from April of 1979, when Bergman returned to his beloved island of Fårö and really tucked into the screenplay. On April 18 that year, he wrote in his diary, "I don't know much about this film, yet it tempts me more than any other. It is enigmatic and demands reflection. But the most important thing is, of course, that the desire is there." He completed the screenplay on July 8, 1979, but not until November 1980 would a press conference be called to announce the production of Fanny and Alexander. In rather unexpected contrast, Bergman introduces the figure of Isak Jacobi, played by Ellen Josephson, one of Bergman's most familiar actors, and known in particular for scenes from a marriage. And his assistant Aaron, played by Ingmar Bergman's own son, Mats. Isak has this bizarre, mysterious and faintly sinister shop in Uppsala. Nobody, says Bergman in his screenplay, has ever seen Isak Jacobi selling or buying anything in his shop. But Oscar Ekdahl's mother, Helena, was born Mandelbaum and has kept in close contact with her Jewish friends in the community. Bergman's screenplay for Fanny and Alexander is, in no sense of the term, a shooting script. You won't find in it any number of the most delicious little incidents that actually make up the complex pattern of the film. For example, here, as Helena greets Isak, Bergman simply writes, "Isak Jacobi now makes his entrance, beaming with delight. His tailcoat is immaculate. His hair and beard are freshly trimmed, and his black eyebrows have been given a neat upward twist. With his nasal bass voice, he compliments Helena on her beauty. He presents her with a little rose in chased silver, with 6 glistening rubies on the stalk instead of thorns. No mention at all of that wonderful moment as Helena glances round to see if anyone's watching and kisses him with erotic devotion on the lips. And we know instantly that there has been a relationship in the past between Isak Jacobi and Helena Ekdahl, and that now they regard each other with tremendous affection. And clearly Isak, although no Christian, is going to be an important figure in the household. And as the film develops, and the battle is joined for the souls, even lives, of Alexander, his sister and his mother, so Isak Jacobi comes in as an outsider to rescue them.
Här kommer min familj.
It's interesting to see the way in which Helena greets her 3 sons. Here comes her youngest son, Gustav Adolf, always so effusive, who she greets very warmly. And now comes Oscar, the eldest, with a flamboyant gesture. And he gets a loving pat for his pains. It's the afternoon, and time to look at the presents under the tree. Here comes Aunt Anna, who doesn't even rate a mention in Bergman's published screenplay of the film. She's played by K.B. Larate, who was Ingmar's fourth wife. I suspect she was given this role fairly late in the production, as Bergman decided to have some piano accompaniment to the Christmas proceedings. And who better to handle that than K.B., who was a brilliant mistress of the keyboard and had played at Carnegie Hall and indeed all over the world in concert halls. Besides, Bergman maintains affectionate links with most of his former lovers. I remember interviewing K.B. at her home in the late 70s, many, many years after they had divorced. And suddenly the phone rang, and when she came back, she said that Ingmar had called from Munich to ask after her tennis elbow, which was causing her problems at the piano.
De kanske har tagit fel på tiden.
Vi har ju ätit julmiddag 5:30 i alla år, det är ju märkligt.
Punctuality is still absolutely essential in Sweden, and particularly in bourgeois society of that period. Even today, if you arrive with your youngster for a kid's party and you're even 2 minutes late, your Swedish hostess is likely to remind you that the party has already begun. Here comes the bickering couple. Bergman is fascinated by such couples, as was his great countryman August Strindberg in his stories and plays. Remember also Mr. and Mrs. Allman in Wild Strawberries, the couple at the roadside who have an accident with Isak Borg's car?
Nå, då kan vi äntligen få äta.
And all Carl gets is a peremptory greeting from his mother and a frosty comment about Christmas dinner being delayed. Bergman describes this lavish feast in his screenplay. Quote, "There is an abundant choice. Countless varieties of pickled herring, sausages, head cheese, pâtés, galantines, au gratin, meatballs, steaks, and cutlets," unquote. Now they launch into this dance throughout the apartment, which exhausts the older members of the family. Although Helena seems to be doing pretty well. And masters, servants, guests are linked indiscriminately in this giddy procession, which symbolizes the togetherness of the family. It's a mark of the special warmth of the Ekdahl family that the servants can participate in the celebrations, almost on an equal footing with their masters. Now we can note a couple of further omissions from the screenplay, both of which shed important light on the characters and mood of the film. The first here, when the incorrigible Gustav Adolf takes Mai behind a screen and arranges an assignation for later in the evening. And the second here, as Oscar Ekdahl leaves the dance and sinks down on the stairs. We can see that he's exhausted, and Bergman's emphasis on the incident makes it an ominous harbinger of things to come. He will, however, recover himself in order to read from the Bible a little later. All this good-natured, almost pagan cheer is in glaring contrast to what lies ahead in the film, when Emily and her family move to the bishop's residence later. One would never guess either that the film's production was so plagued with hassles. Bergman himself fell a victim to influenza during the shooting, and Peter Schilt, his assistant, had to film the big funeral cortege. Bertil Guver hurt his knee during an ice hockey game, and Cecilia Drott, in charge of the wigs and masks, displaced a vertebra and was told by her doctors that she could not work on the picture. Sven Nykvist caught the bug too and was briefly replaced by Tony Forsberg behind the camera. Then the chief electrician tumbled into the orchestra pit at the Söder Theatre in Stockholm, breaking both legs in the process. Overall, though, most of the people involved in the production recall it as an easy and pleasant shoot. And Carl, who now smuggles the children out of the party for a spot of flatulence, is played by Börje Ahlstedt. Those of you who own the Criterion DVD box of I Am Curious, Yellow and Blue will know him in his younger form as Lena's tireless companion in sex and political debate. Ahlstedt has been in and out of Swedish film and theatre for some 4 decades. He played King Lear at the Royal Dramatic Theatre in 2003, for example. And he's absolutely sensational in Bergman's final TV movie, Saraband. Bergman's always been obsessed, by his own admission, with anal noises and functions. It's said that when news came through of a win for Smiles of a Summer Night at the Cannes Festival, Bergman was pondering the meaning of existence in the restrooms at Svensk, and quickly rushed up to his boss at the company and said, "Now we've won, let me make the 7th seal." He certainly has a lusty, scatological sense of humour that delights the children so much.
Nummer 1. Nu kommer du då.
This earthiness is an essential ingredient of Bergman's personality. It's the spirit shown by Fried, the groom, in Smiles of a Summer Night, or by Tubal in The Magician.
Det begav sig i de dagar.
Of course, we've read a lot about Ingmar Bergman and the tense and even violent relationship he had with his parents, and particularly with his father. I think that in Fanny and Alexander, Bergman's trying to restore the balance somewhat. I think he felt that he treated his father rather badly in his recollections, or as a shadow looming over many of his films. And so in the character of Oscar Ekdahl, there is something of Pastor Eric Bergman, who used to read verses exactly like this on Christmas Day when they celebrated in the Bergman home.
Ty han var av Davids hus och släkt. Till att låta skattskriva sig med Maria, sin trolovade hustru, vilken havande var.
This is not just a nice little homage to Jean Vigo's Zero de Conduite, which was also, of course, acknowledged in a similar rumble among the boys in Lindsay Anderson's If. It's also very important in the light of what will happen later in the film, because it's a contrast with the future that lies ahead for these children. They don't realize how fortunate they are to enjoy the warm family atmosphere that they do in the Ekdahl household. This is a revealing little exchange between Maj, the maid, and Alma Ekdahl. The wife of Gustav Adolf knows perfectly well that her husband's been flirting with Maj, and so she gives the poor woman a slap for her pains. On the face of it, it's because of the chaos raging in the nursery, but Maj recognizes that Alma has the situation under surveillance. She's saying with that slap, "Okay, you can have a one-night stand, but don't go too far. He's my husband." I like Bergman's fluid photography here. Nothing is absolutely static in this film. Even in that long-held shot of Oscar reading from the Bible, the camera retreated steadily so as to bring the entire family and all the servants into view. So in this scene, the camera work is very agile, moving around like some lively spectator, and only stopping at a moment like this, as the prayers are recited. The prayers once again underline the cohesion of the family. And always the music box playing in the background, the music box and the glass lantern slide that Bergman has mentioned so often in his interviews and in his autobiography, which he called the Magic Lantern. The lighting reflects that mysterious stage between the brightness of day and the dream state of night.
Alexander. Alexander.
Mai comes to Alexander like a conspirator.
Titta, jag har fått av fru Ekdahl. Det är inte klokt. Jag är inte vansinnigt vacker. Jag är inte underbart fin. Jag ser ut som en dam. Visst gör jag?
He's quickly jealous of the fact that he won't be allowed to share Mai's bed tonight. It's obviously a platonic relationship, but it's a nice way of showing how, in a family like this, the bond between the children and the servants would be more exciting than it was with their own parents, who were rather distant figures. Mai can express the physical affection that the parents never could for the sake of decorum. Mai is probably based on Lalla, the maid who Bergman adored when he was a small boy, staying with his grandmother in Uppsala. Now Alexander's thoughts start to turn to the magic lantern that he longs to play with. I'll read a passage from the magic lantern in a minute when this scene develops. But Bergman will interrupt it for a moment to show the party breaking up and the sons taking their leave of old Helena Ekdahl.
Nej, nu mina kära får vi allt säga godnatt. Vi ska upp tidigt.
Sven Nykvist really did pull out all the stops with this film, his last great work for Bergman. With the smoke-laden atmosphere and the background there framed almost as in one of the lantern slides that Alexander likes so much. Bergman had also called for this type of lighting in his movie about Germany in the 1920s, The Serpent's Egg.
God natt, tant. God natt.
God natt, mamma.
And Isak slips round the Christmas tree and renews his old acquaintanceship with Helena Ekdahl. So, as I was saying, in The Magic Lantern, Bergman describes the Christmas evening at his childhood home. In the nursery, he writes, quote, "A transparency of the nativity scene and the shepherds at prayer was glimmering faintly on the tall chest of drawers. Among my brother's other Christmas presents on the white gate-legged table was the cinematograph, with its crooked chimney, its beautifully shaped brass lens, and its rack for the film loops. I made a swift decision. I woke my brother and proposed a deal. I offered my 100 tin soldiers in exchange for the cinematograph. As Dag possessed a huge army and was always involved in war games with his friends, an agreement was made to the satisfaction of both parties. The cinematograph was mine. It wasn't a complicated machine. The source of light was a paraffin lamp, and the crank was attached with a cogwheel and a Maltese cross. At the back of the metal box was a simple reflecting mirror. Behind the lens, a slot for coloured lantern slides. The apparatus also included a square purple box, which contained some glass slides and a sepia-coloured film strip. This was about 3 meters long and glued into a loop. Information on the lid stated that the film was called Mrs. Holler. Who this Mrs. Holler was, no one knew, but later it turned out that she was a popular equivalent of the goddess of love in Mediterranean countries." Unquote. The little boy with the mask, who makes them all jump with fright, is actually a character we're not really introduced to in the film. But he's quite interesting because his name is Putta, and Putta is the nickname that was ascribed to young Ingmar by his sister Margareta and his brother Dag in the Bergman household. And there's that line a little earlier when we've heard Emily leaving the nursery and whispering, "Putta kisses like a man." And that's a little private joke that Bergman slips in. When I visited the set of the film in early 1982, Bergman remarked that, quote, "This film's not so much a chronicle as a Gobelin tapestry. You can pick the images and incidents and characters from it that fascinate you," unquote. But I'm reminded by that scene in the nursery of something else he mentioned. The film was conceived, he said, on the rebound, after he had been talking with his friend, the director, Kjell Greda. Greda asked Bergman why he, who so obviously loved life and found parts of it so funny, produced only gloomy and depressing pictures. The answer seems to lie in Bergman's childhood. "There was a very twisted atmosphere in my home," he told me between takes. "Sometimes it was very happy, very amusing. We liked to play games, play theatre, play music. When my father was in a good mood, he was a wonderful man. But when he had his depressions, then the mood was certainly very heavy. And as children, we could never understand the abruptness of these changes," unquote. But then, aren't most parents like that in the eyes of their children? Bergman's own sons and daughters have all probably enjoyed a better relationship with him in adult life than they did as youngsters. The virtue of Fanny and Alexander is that Bergman does manage to include so many humorous moments. The scene we're watching now, however, between Gun Wahlgren and Erland Josephson, illustrates the more melancholy side of that life. We know from Private Confessions, the screenplay that Bergman wrote a few years after Fanny and Alexander, and that was directed by Liv Ullmann, we know that his mother had an affair outside her very straight-laced marriage with Pastor Erik Bergman. And this scene confirms that Helena Ekdahl has had an affair with Isak Jacobi. There's this sense of what might have been, had she not been trapped in this bourgeois lifestyle, had she been able to escape to a more exotic, more fascinating life. And now she's reduced to gossiping about her sons and reminiscing with a clearly exhausted Isak Jacobi. It's after 3 a.m. and morning service begins at 5. That again is based on fact, because Bergman in his memoirs noted how short the night was between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, because everyone had to be roused at 5 to attend morning service. A word about the costumes at this point. They're some of the best ever designed for a Bergman film. They were done by Marieke Vos Lund, who won an Academy Award for her efforts, after being nominated in 1961 for The Virgin Spring and in 1974 for Cries and Whispers. She made such a memorable contribution to Cries and Whispers, with those Bergman women, you remember, rustling in long white dresses through scarlet-draped rooms. She prepared the costumes for Fanny and Alexander for more than a year, and had a team of 17 designers and seamstresses working for her. There were 260 key costumes to be made, each of which had to be tested and approved by Bergman, photographed on 16mm film, and also recorded by Bergman's still photographer Anna Karlsson. Fanny and Alexander wasn't made only on the 2 huge modern stages of the Swedish Film Institute. It also spilled over into the studios of Europa Film in the suburbs of Stockholm. Even then, the production designers, led by Anna Asp and Suzanne Lingheim, who won an Academy Award for their achievement on Fanny and Alexander, had to perform miracles of improvisation and compression. The task facing them in 1981 was gigantic. There was the Ekdahl apartment, with Helena's suite of rooms, and the apartments reserved for Oscar and Emily, and also for Carl and Lydia. Then the bishop's home, with its austere, unnerving and claustrophobic atmosphere. Then the lair of Isak Jacobi, which comes into its own later in the film. And in addition, there was the theatre itself, where the Nativity play has been held. The exteriors looked pretty much after themselves and were found in Uppsala. But the research for all this took the best part of a year to ensure that the turn-of-the-century look could be captured on screen. Back as far as The Naked Knight, Smiles of a Summer Night and The Seventh Seal, Bergman had shown himself a master at conjuring up a vanished way of life, using costumes and props with not even a trace of self-consciousness. You can see the richness of the decor here, the pictures, the antiques, the textiles, the lamps. And now Bergman shrewdly lightens the mood, and a scene that could have become rather lachrymose actually turns out to be rather funny. Helena evokes a memory of her infidelity with Isak, which is like something straight out of Smiles of a Summer Night, actually, or, as she says, out of a farce by Feydeau.
Någon pjäs av Feydeau. Jag skrek och du försökte kasta den på dörren. Han rusade efter sin pistol och jag hängde mig fast vid hans ben. Och sen blev ni vänner för livet.
Erland Josephson is probably the most faithful of all Bergman's collaborators. The two men first met in the late 1930s, when Bergman directed a high school theatre production of The Merchant of Venice, with Erland playing Antonio. Although he didn't appear in many of Bergman's early films, Josephson certainly made a real impression in The Magician, when he played the arrogant consul, who's cuckolded in his own home, but who exerts a rather sinister authority. And in the same year, 1958, he appeared in a little-seen Bergman feature called Brink of Life, in which he played a detached, alarmingly disdainful doctor. Then Bergman would use him at odd intervals in films like Hour of the Wolf, The Passion of Anna, Cries and Whispers, Scenes from a Marriage, and Face to Face, usually giving him a beard like the one he wears here. Giving him, too, a faintly sardonic and rather fastidious quality.
Godnatt, min sköna Helena.
Du var en söt älskare. Du var så smultron.
And here indeed, it's almost 5 a.m.
Klockan är 5:10.
But Gustav Adolf is still going strong with Mai, using those tried and tested aphrodisiacs, fresh oysters. Now, we haven't actually said much yet about the way Bergman had to apply the scissors to reduce the massive amount of footage he'd shot. He prepared the theatrical version first, and then the longer TV version. What he did was to take out those scenes which so often work when you're sitting comfortably on a sofa at home, and you can get up during a commercial break or just record the program and see it later. Whereas when you're in a theatre, you have to be involved in the film, and Bergman's very aware of this. In fact, I think he became more aware of the need to absorb the audience as his career developed, rather than the other way round. His later productions are, if anything, somewhat more involving than his very early ones, when he was first and foremost working out his own private anxieties on screen. What he did cut out from this part of Fanny and Alexander was a nice scene when Oscar Ekdahl comes into the nursery and improvises a bit of business with a simple chair. He starts describing it as having magical properties and beguiles the children and emphasizes to us, the audience, both how charming Oscar was and also how the magic of the theatre can be conjured up by someone who really believes in his part.
Julnatten 1907. Ja, det här är ett kontrakt, förstår du lite. Du sticker det bara under näsan på en advokat och jag skulle glömma mina löften.
Pernilla Wahlgren, who plays Mai, later changed her name to August when she married the Danish director Billy August. Her links with Bergman's universe remained strong, for in 1992 she starred in her husband's The Best Intentions, playing Anna Åkerblom, the mother of Ingmar Bergman, as a young woman. Some years later she played the same role again in Liv Ullmann's Private Confessions. George Lucas chose her to play the mother of young Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, and its sequel, Attack of the Clones. Pernilla August is clearly a favourite of Bergman's because she appeared in a couple of his later TV plays. Like many of his regular actresses, she is featured in several stage productions directed by Bergman at the Royal Dramatic Theatre. For example, she appeared in Mary Stuart, which came to the Brooklyn Academy of Music a few years ago. She has an unusual ability to switch from a giggling nursemaid to a woman of considerable gravity.
Hur skulle man kunna må dåligt med en sån liten snäcka? Kom, sätt dig gränsle.
Bergman has treated sex throughout his career in a very robust and uninhibited way, going all the way back to 1952, when he shot Summer with Monica with a nubile Harriet Anderson out in the Stockholm archipelago. The sex scenes in that film seemed risque for the time, although never pornographic as such. They showed instead first the sheer lustiness of sex at its best, followed by the stale, bitter relationship that can so often ensue. There's an intimacy in the way Bergman films sex that's so instantly convincing.
Jag har ett fantastiskt gott hjärta.
Måste han ge mig en ny säng?
Du ska få ett konditori och en våning och vackra möbler och en stor liten säng.
Och snygga kläder.
Ingen ska vara vackrare än du.
There's a tremendous warmth, I think, in this scene between Gustav, Adolf and Mai that will only be marred by a simple misunderstanding.
Han är dum.
Va?
Han är dum, säger
Är jag dum?
han. Han är riktigt dumskalle.
Jag är väl ingen dumskalle.
It's when she tells him that she never really wanted anything from him.
Vill du inte ha något?
Förstår han inte att jag skojar med honom?
He takes umbrage at this because, after all, we are in 1907, when a prosperous bourgeois like Gustav Adolf would have had a wife and mistress in almost official tandem. It would all be arranged to a regular schedule.
Men sluta skratta.
Jag tycker han är så lustig.
Nej.
At least it's a happier state of affairs than what we're now confronted with, the painful marriage of the middle Ekdal son, Karl, with his German-born wife. This dialogue, in fact, resurrects the late 40s in Bergman's career, when he first started to dissect this kind of arid relationship. From the start, he could write the kind of vituperative, waspish dialogue that owes a great deal to his mentor, the playwright August Strindberg. Some of Strindberg's most famous lines might have come from a Bergman movie. "We're welded together and can't get free," as Alice cries to her husband in The Dance of Death. And marriage is described as, at best, a pact between friendly warriors, in another Strindberg play entitled Creditors.
Jag har några smycken.
Idiot. Det skulle se snyggt ut, va? Professor Ekdal springer hos pantlånaren.
Ska du inte komma att lägga dig nu, manschett?
Certainly, Karl and Lydia are shackled together in their unhappiness. A line from Bergman's 1949 film, Thirst, applies to this relationship. Quote, "Hell together is better than hell alone."
Det luktar illa. Jag vet inte vad det kommer sig. Jag hade slutat tvätta det eller började ruttna.
I feel particularly sorry here for Christina Skolin, because she was actually a big, glamorous star in Sweden during the 1960s. She had enjoyed popular success in a 1961 movie called Do You Believe in Angels? But her big breakthrough proved to be Dear John in 1964, a bittersweet romance in which she was hopelessly attracted to none other than Jarl Kulle, who we've just seen in the previous scene as Gustav Adolf. So both those actors came through professionally over the 2 decades dividing Dear John and Fanny and Alexander. This, on the face of it, is such an unsympathetic part for Christina Skolin to play, or it strikes us at first as unsympathetic.
Hur blir man en medelmåtta? Kan du svara mig på det? Hur faller dammet? När har man förlorat?
There are so many couples in Bergman's world who tear each other apart, and there are also incidents like this, where the male, who's always seen as rather pathetic, full of bluster and little substance, will cut himself or suffer from toothache or some minor ailment. For example, in Shame or Hour of the Wolf, the characters played by Max von Sydow are equally feeble. Karl has been cast aside by his mother and seems unlikely to get much of the family money or to have any influence in family affairs. Yet he and Lydia are trying to keep up social appearances. But in reality, they haven't even enough money to buy firewood for heating. Börje Ahlstedt manages to convince us that he can switch in a twinkling from overwhelming self-pity to being a cruel, even vicious husband.
Du kan aldrig förlåta mig. Jag är skit och en fel.
Om du vill ska jag göra dig en varm vintårta.
Var inte så förbannat servil!
Bergman had plenty of experience on which to draw in this department. His second wife was Ellen Lundström, who he met while working in a theatre in southern Sweden. That marriage wasn't exactly harmonious, and the bitterness that racks films like Thirst and Prison bears witness to it. Personally, though, I think this sequence is too protracted and verges on self-parody simply by being too long. It was actually much longer in the screenplay, and Bergman wisely left a good deal on the cutting room floor.
Sträck ut din hand och du famlar i tomheten.
It's implied, I think, that Karl and Lydia have no children, always an ominous sign where Bergman's concerned. After all, he's the father of 7 himself. And, like his brother for once, Gustav Adolf is down in the mouth. He's still smarting from poor Mai's well-meaning remark about not wanting any charity from him. So he prepares to leave the attic and a disillusioned Mai. And Bergman will be at pains now to show the young daughter as part of the family unit.
God morgon, pappa.
God morgon, Petra. Får man ingen puss?
If anyone can control Gustav Adolf, it's his wife. And she's played with a self-satisfied authority by Mona Malm, who was 46 when Fanny and Alexander went into production. Mona Malm and Bergman go way back. She appeared as a maid in Smiles of a Summer Night, and then as a pregnant woman in The Seventh Seal. She finally featured in Bergman's misfire of a comedy, All These Women, in 1964, playing Cecilia and wearing her hair with bangs in the Louise Brooks style. Some years after Fanny and Alexander, she played another Alma, this time the mother of Henrik Bergman in The Best Intentions, which was a thinly disguised study of Ingmar's parents and their relationship. Alma's an intriguing name for Bergman, one of those that, like Henrik, Marianne and Karin, recurs over and over again in his films. Its rather brainy and bounteous ring, as in Alma Mater, appeals to Bergman. His Almas are usually women who have an instinctive knowledge of how life ticks. Liv Ullmann in Hour of the Wolf, for example, or Bibi Andersson in Persona. They may be easily cheated, but the Almas of Bergman's world know how to go with the flow and ride the currents of life, however violent they may be. Another appealing aspect of Bergman's treatment of sex is that it's not restricted to the young and gorgeous. In film after film, he shows how middle-aged couples can enjoy a quickie or a lusty exchange, just as more often he shows the opposite, a barren marriage shorn of all erotic elements. Here's the lovely naughtiness of the boudoir and the zest of the Belle Époque. Petra is a name that always belongs in Bergman to someone who's pert and youthful and often a maid. And her reaction to the huffing and puffing beyond the door suggests that she's heard it all before. Here she's played by Maria Granlund, who was 22 at the time, but who apparently did not work again in the cinema. It's only a tiny part, as the daughter who prepares the beer and breakfast, but she makes the most of it.
Kan du inte?
Nej, det måste vara något fel.
Du är sjuk, Gustav.
Nej, för fan. Jag mår hur bra som helst.
I've referred to Bergman's classical style and also Bergman's comparison with Gobelin tapestries. But the more often I see Fanny and Alexander, the more conscious I am of its literary quality. I mean that in a positive sense too, for this film is like one of the great 19th century novels by Balzac or Zola, with its rich gallery of characters and its wealth of dramatic incident. Bergman's visual style, however, prevents the film from congealing into the kind of literary adaptation we associate with Hollywood biopics of the 30s, for example. A comparison of the camera movements in Fanny and Alexander with those in any Bergman film of the early 1950s demonstrates how much more fluent his film language has become. He can dwell for long spells on a single close-up, but when the occasion warrants it, he has Sven Nykvist dollying hither and thither and zooming slowly in and out to great effect. All of these scenes were filmed on location in Uppsala, and the snow was not created by machines for the most part, because it was shot during the winter of 1981-82, and snow is normal for that time of year in central Sweden. In these few shots, Bergman communicates the idea of a community gathering together for certain things such as church services and festivities, with the torches waving in the early morning gloom and the hiss of the runners and the jostle of the sleigh bells on the soundtrack. Here comes an example of how Bergman has trimmed the longer version in order to arrive at a manageable theatrical version. A whole chunk of Shakespeare's Hamlet has been excised here. Bergman prefers to give emphasis to the scenes backstage, with a couple having a quick shag and some pals playing chess. People quite unconcerned with the rehearsals being played out on the big stage. Now there on the left with a beard is none other than Gunnar Björnstrand, who played the squire in The Seventh Seal and the priest in Winter Light. He only has a few brief scenes in the film. He was then towards the end of his life and very ill, and appeared in Fanny and Alexander as a favour to Bergman. And Bergman, of course, was also doing a favour to him. It was old companions coming together again. Björnstrand first worked for Bergman in 1946.
Danmarks kungabädd får vara ett bestars och den fräcka blodskams läger.
Just before Oscar breaks down here, Alexander is dreaming of something that the situation in Hamlet has triggered in his mind. The idea that this could be his own story, that his father will die and his mother will marry an evil man, and in so doing will neglect the children. And the father's ghost will return to remind Alexander of his duty.
Var är jag? Här är jag här. På teatern.
This is where Alexander is stunned. He starts to rise, but remains transfixed. He can't go closer to his father, and stays in the chair, as though sensing that all this is indeed the chronicle of a death foretold.
Jag tror vi ska gå hem och vila lite.
The frontier between play and reality is bridged here. Clearly Oscar's suffered some kind of stroke, and Emily realizes that it may be more than just a fainting fit.
Vad gör jag här?
Spelade teater.
Spela teater? Varför spelar jag teater?
Kom nu, Oskar, så går vi hem.
Ska jag dö nu?
Now the pace of the scene changes. And Bergman cuts to this high, remote shot of the company rushing to get Oscar out of the theatre quickly. It's reminiscent of the closing sequence in Chaplin's Limelight, when Calvero, the old clown played by Chaplin himself, collapses backstage. And Mai comes back to look for Alexander. This is another of the many suggestions in the film, that Alexander is actually closer to Mai than to his own mother. Emily has not even thought of Alexander during this crisis, but Mai has, just as she will when Fanny and Alexander are snared in their new life at the bishop's house, and she will feel profoundly affected by their destiny. Mai is one of those essentially good-hearted people in Bergman's films, like Mia in The Seventh Seal, or the maid Anna in Cries and Whispers. And now the film enters one of its most grueling phases. It's a great mistake to think of Fanny and Alexander as a comedy, in the sense that Smiles of a Summer Night is a comedy. Bergman himself classifies it as a comedy in his book Images, but perhaps that's because it begins and ends on a lighter note than many of his pictures. Yet in so many ways, Fanny and Alexander is a tragedy. It shows the perfect situation, a family living in joyous harmony before the Great War, rich, comfortable, enjoying life, and with the children growing up in a protected environment. And suddenly, this one shocking incident can change everything for the worse. You can see, incidentally, from the breath of the actors that this was filmed in real snow in a real Swedish winter. Bergman has dealt with death in various films, and perhaps most notably in Cries and Whispers, which was punishing from start to finish in its unblinking study of a woman's death from cancer and the impact on those around her. And The Seventh Seal, of course, which featured death as an actual character, and made my grandmother, when we first saw the film in London in 1958, rise to her feet in the midst of the film and declare, "There's too much talk about death in this film. I'm going home to cook the supper." So I think an older generation has always found Bergman's films rather hard to take. That actress on the left, by the way, is Anna Bergman, one of Ingmar's children by his second marriage. She wasn't particularly close to her father in early years, and went off to London, where she appeared in some, how shall I say, pretty risque, low-budget pictures. But she saw more of her father as he grew older, and it's nice that she has this part as an actress in the Ekdal theatre troupe. This very, very controlled behavior of the family relatives and of the doctor seems to embody the very notion of grace under pressure. But it's interrupted by Lydia, who lives up to her image as the rather ill-bred outsider who can't control her emotions. Yet in that moment we rather side with her, don't we?
Kan ni tänka er, barn? Det här brevet, det ska gå ända till en liten missionsstation i Kina.
I'd like to say something about Svea Holst. She's the actress playing Esther and writing a letter to the writer frame here.
Hon har bott där i 50 år.
Svea Holst was one of the few performers working in Swedish cinema in 1982 who still had a foothold in the silent era. She actually appeared in the Norrtull League in 1923 with a virtually all-female cast directed by Per Lindberg. And Bergman got to know her very early in his career. For example, she even appeared in Crisis, his very first film. And then she had small, often uncredited parts in some of his other early pictures, like A Ship Bound for India, Music in the Dark, and To Joy. She played Jean's mother in the great award-winning version of Miss Julie, made by Alf Scherberg. She had a small, uncredited role in Smiles of a Summer Night, and in 1969, Bergman brought her back for another little part, the wife of Werner in The Passion of Anna. She continued working until she was in her late 80s and died at the age of 95. She was over 80 when she was sitting there at that desk, remembering her lines without a problem. Svea Holst is typical of a kind of professional actor that has devoted herself to Swedish theatre, film and television without ever quite achieving stardom.
Slicka på ett frimärke, Alexander.
Nej, tack.
Då får du slicka på frimärket då. Tack ska du ha, lilla gumman.
The other servant in this scene, Vega, is played by Maj-Lis Granlund. She was born 2 years after Svea Holst had made her debut on the screen in 1923. Maj-Lis Granlund is interesting because she appears in a similar role as Lalla, the family maid, in Sunday's Children, directed by Ingmar's son, Daniel. And Sunday's Children evokes the Bergman childhood in another light, a sunnier light, certainly. And she also featured in a TV movie that Bergman made in 1986, entitled The Blessed Ones. That's her, over on the left now. Whenever the camera dwells in close-up on Alexander, Bergman has asked him to express a kind of contained resentment. And Bertil Guver does it very well, because he keeps the expression throughout the film. It's a fixed look that tells us he knows life will be tougher than people have said it will be, and yet he's afraid of it. He's extremely sensitive, as was Bergman, obviously, as a child. His little sister observes everything that goes on, but she doesn't have that interior truculence. She's able to get on with her everyday life much more easily. In fact, the whole film might justifiably have been called Alexander and Fanny, because Fanny has a much less dramatic profile in the film. It might almost have been called Alexander, period. And Helena has to set an example for the family by not exhibiting her grief.
Kom nu.
This is typical of Bergman. A shot of a bucket containing some unmentionable fluid, a clock, some medicines and a watch, before allowing the longer shots to take over.
Jag väntar där ute.
Kom hit, Fanny.
Art director Anna Asp opted for white to suggest death, just as white roses are sent to funerals. It's an intriguing contrast with Cries and Whispers, where the predominant colour is red, suggesting blood. But here the white works very well because there's an ethereal purity about it, and almost an antiseptic quality. Bergman was very conscious of the fact that a death often implies reconciliation between child and parent. In his own case, he was in his mid-40s when his mother passed away, and he arrived at the family apartment just a few minutes too late to say farewell to her. But in his memoirs, The Magic Lantern, he confesses that, quote, "To my surprise, I began to weep loudly and uncontrollably. That soon passed, and the old doctor stood in silence holding my hand. Not long afterwards, I was alone with Mother in the silent apartment. She was lying in her bed, wearing a flannel nightgown and a knitted blue bed jacket. Her head was turned slightly sideways and her lips were parted. She was pale with shadows round her eyes. Her still dark hair was neatly combed. No, her hair was no longer dark, but iron grey, and in recent years had been cut short. But the image of her in my memory tells me her hair was dark, possibly streaked with grey. I sat there for several hours. The church bells of Hedvig Eleonora rang for morning service. The light shifted and I could hear piano music somewhere." Unquote. And of course that's why I think Bergman brought in that furious clamour of church bells as Oscar was rushed through the snow after falling ill at the theatre. As Fanny and Alexander progresses, it will become clearer that Bergman identifies with Oscar Ekdahl as he did in real life with his mother, to whom he was attached by a truly spiritual bond. I remember when Bergman came to the Cannes Festival in 1973 with Cries and Whispers. He held a huge press conference, and someone asked him if he had overcome his fear of death now, through treating it in so many films. He said quite simply, "You know, for me, death is like the switching out of lights in a room. That's all it is." Unquote. But deep down, I think that in this sequence, and also in as recent a work as Saraband, there are definite intimations that Bergman still cherishes a belief in some existence after life. Friends say that he's convinced that he will be reunited with his late wife, Ingrid, in some dimension or another. This is a very cruel and horrific scene. In the screenplay, Bergman writes that Alexander, and then Fanny, who always slept more deeply, were awoken by the sound of sobbing. They go through the apartment, and they see their mother sobbing her heart out. But in fact, when he got to the set, Bergman made Eva Fröhling really scream with agony. It's a most terrible, primal cry of grief. We're used to seeing this kind of thing in Italian films like Rosi's Salvatore Giuliano or Three Brothers. We regard that as a Latin or Middle Eastern response to death, with women beating their breasts and tearing their hair. But it's quite a shock to witness such a scene in a Scandinavian film. It's utterly relentless, and Bergman gives us no quarter. As the children advance, Bergman forces us to share their grief by having a long lens shot of Oscar Ekdahl lying on his deathbed covered with white roses, and Emily, the widow, pacing back and forth. He refuses to cut while she goes on screaming, so that the physical agony drives to the heart, and particularly to Alexander. It's something that will mark him for life. Bergman astutely contrasts the rigidity of the corpse, like a tableau, with the restless movement of the woman, from left to right and right to left, like some kind of infernal metronome. This extraordinarily pompous funeral sequence is, of course, exactly what Oscar Ekdahl would not have wanted. But in a scene that was cut from the theatrical version, we witness the colonel of the local garrison and other dignitaries coming to pay their respects to Emily and telling her that they would organize the ceremony with full military honors, including Chopin's funeral march. Here too, for the first time, we see the Bishop Vergerus, a man who will become the key personality in the second part of the film. People bearing the name Vergerus in Bergman are either heavies, for example, the Doctor in The Magician, the Heinz Bennant character in The Serpent's Egg, and Ellen Josephson in The Passion of Anna, or they're dim-witted, like the Max von Sydow husband in The Touch. The whole funeral sequence was actually supervised by the assistant director, Peter Schilt, because Bergman was suffering from a very bad case of flu in January 1982. This is characteristic Bergman, where little Alexander utters all these forbidden swear words, shocking his younger sister. But he's doing it mostly to keep up his own spirits and to stake out his own territory in a world governed by conventions. In the screenplay, it states that this meal ran to 14 courses and that the guests drank 7 different wines. And Alexander has some instinctive distrust of the conversation, or let's say the incipient link that seems to be growing between Emily and the bishop. Bergman writes in the screenplay that, quote, "The bishop's eyes are glistening and he never stops talking. Emily now has a little colour in her pale cheeks, and her soft mouth smiles briefly and modestly, without disturbing the gentle gravity emanating from her slender figure," unquote. So it's their grandmother who thinks of the youngsters and allows them to leave the table. In the screenplay, it is Emily who gives them permission. So, once again, Bergman has made a subtle but psychologically correct amendment to his own original thought. Nobody is fussing over them anymore. Nobody is coming to put them to bed. Mai's too busy with all the catering for the wake. They must amuse themselves. And then comes this mysterious sound of a spinet. Bergman has said that he had 2 principal sources of inspiration for Fanny and Alexander. One was E.T.A. Hoffmann, the German writer of the early 1800s, who's famous most of all for the Tales of Hoffmann, made into an opera by Jacques Offenbach, and then in 1951 into a movie by the team of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. And the other inspiration was Charles Dickens, the English 19th century novelist. And in this scene, those 2 sources seem to merge. For the first time, apart from that brief moment when Alexander saw the statue move, we have a sense of another dimension. The magic that can be wrought with sufficient mental strength. And so, like the scene in Hamlet we've seen Oscar rehearsing before his collapse, so Alexander is able to see his father. We're not sure if Fanny can see him. She just senses some presence in the room, but Alexander has the gift of the seer. Bergman adroitly switches his moods throughout Fanny and Alexander. The cheerful way in which Alexander is running through the marketplace in sunshine suggests instantly that there's been a lapse of time. Now, an important sequence has been cut here. He passes the theatre, and in a stray remark we sense that perhaps Emily has not been to the theatre in quite a spell. In fact, in the longer version, there is a scene at the theatre. It's actually quite moving. It shows Gunnar Björnstrand in what would be his final appearance for Bergman, playing the clown in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, with a candle on his head and doing a long monologue. It had to be done over and over, and it was one of the toughest moments in the actor's career. But Bergman has cut it out from the theatrical version. What he's also cut, however, is Emily's speech to the stage company when she tells them that she really wants out of the theatre world. "You'll be fine as you are," she tells them in effect, and the actors are very shocked. There's a feeling that the troupe will break up. But Emily has already undergone a profound change since the death of her husband. In these shots, with Alexander, she's made up in such a way as to register that difference. And we can tell that the servants are confused by the situation. Emily seems, not for the first time in the film, to be under a kind of hypnotic spell. She's obviously been beguiled by this good-looking, charismatic man of the church.
God dag, Alexander.
God dag.
Vi har ju träffats tidigare, du och jag. Under sorgliga förhållanden när jag jordfäste din far.
This is the first of some deadly duels between Alexander and the bishop.
Jag är nära vän till din farmor. Jag är församlingens själasörjare.
Biskopen har varit mycket god mot mig under den här svåra tiden, Alexander.
The bishop is played by Jan Malmsjö, who is not one of Bergman's regular actors, although he did appear in the opening episode of Scenes from a Marriage as the cynical husband of Bibi Andersson. He's better known in Sweden as an entertainer, equally at home in musicals, cabaret, or dramatic performances. Although you'd never guess it from his role here, Malmsjö is actually an extremely witty and affectionate man. The role of the bishop was originally written by Bergman with Max von Sydow in mind. Max was in Hollywood at the time he was approached and hadn't appeared in a Bergman film for more than 10 years. So when Paul Kohner, his agent, called him about the offer, Max read the script and agreed enthusiastically to play the bishop. His agent held out for a percentage as well as a fee, and the Swedes balked at this. When Max heard about it, he told Kohner to drop the demand for points in the picture because the role was so appealing. But by the time Kohner could contact the Swedes again, they had already approached Jan Malmsjö. Max still feels bitter about this incident, although that's not to detract from Malmsjö's towering presence in Fanny and Alexander.
Du tycker att det var en dum fråga. Det var det också.
Dramatically, Bergman is turning the screws here. He has not only introduced abruptly this new domineering and probably diabolical character who wears the cloth of the church, but seems to be the devil incarnate, and has all the sardonic wit and inquisitorial arrogance of the typical Bergman villain in films like The Magician or The Ritual or Wild Strawberries.
Varför ljuger man, Alexander? Kan du förklara för mig varför?
But Bergman is also showing how Alexander is developing as a young man. And there he's reaching deep into his own childhood memories. Because in repeated interviews, Bergman has told us how he was humiliated in much the same fashion by his father whenever he transgressed, in quotes, and how he would be first catechized and then punished. In word and gesture, Bergman communicates the intimidating personality of Bishop Vergerus, the way he talks in such a superficially cordial manner, but showing the mailed fist beneath the velvet glove, as it were, by tapping the boy's head harder than necessary or taking him by the scruff of the neck like a domestic pet. It all shows that he means to hurt Alexander.
Då fortsätter jag fråga, och nu får du förlåta mig att jag blir lite mer personlig. Kan du förklara för din mor och mig, varför har du ljugit i skolan?
Vadå? Din klassföreståndare har skrivit till mig och berättat att du har spritt ut de märkvärdigaste lögner i klassen.
Vadå?
Såld till cirkus.
Vill du förneka att du påstått inför dina klasskamrater att jag skulle ha sålt dig till en kringresande cirkus?
And now that we hear what he's been saying at school, it all seems too absurd. And Bergman deliberately makes it this kind of transgression to show how such a clenched upbringing can distort a personality. Alexander has not yet rebelled. He's shrewd enough to go along with this charade because he loves his mother and he wants to protect her.
Gå nu fram till din mor och be henne om förlåtelse. Du hör vad jag säger, inte sant?
Jag ber mor om förlåtelse för att jag ljugit och lovar att aldrig göra det igen.
And he just mouths the words of apology. In the screenplay, Bergman describes him as a puppet without his strings, and Bertil Guber's position in this shot suggests exactly that, I think. And the way the bishop touches and looks at Emily is so different to the way that he regards Alexander. And their shared complicity is appalling to Alexander. And now Emily will announce to them that she intends to marry the bishop. And so, in the space of a few seconds, the children's lives have irrevocably changed.
Edvard har frågat om jag vill gifta mig med honom. Jag har med tacksamhet och glädje tagit emot hans anbud.
It's a revealing tableau here, with the bishop in the background and then advancing out of the distance, like a dark shadow to loom over the family's hitherto bright-lit lives. We can gauge that Emily is embarking on this with mixed emotions. She's infatuated with the bishop and by his honeyed phrases, but at the same time she has an emotional reaction that reveals her anxiety at going into this new religious life. How often the word family has been invoked to justify cruelty and repression. And once again, Alexander perceives the figure of his father, and the parallels with Hamlet become more accentuated.
Jag ber dig, Gud, att jag ska få kraft att vara ett skydd och ett föredöme för dessa faderlösa små. Och jag ber dig också om kraft att få vara ett stöd för denna unga ensamma kvinna.
So now we are introduced to Emily's new home. This forbidding bishop's palace, as Bergman calls it ironically in his screenplay, is dominated by its plain walls and bare boarded floors. Designed and constructed, one can tell, with almost satanic pleasure by Anna Asp and her team at the Swedish Film Institute studios. And here comes a group of typical Bergman supporting characters. Smiling, yet sinister. The mother, played by Marianne Aminoff, who was actually Liv Ullmann's mother in Face to Face and Ingrid Bergman's secretary in Autumn Sonata. And on the right, the bishop's sister, played by Kerstin Tidelius, who enthusiasts of Scandinavian cinema may remember seeing back in the 60s in Jan Troell's Ole Dole Doff or Bo Widerberg's The Odalen Riots. The cook is played by Marit Olsen, who has a gaunt stare that appeals to Bergman. She was actually an extra in To Joy, directed by Bergman back in 1949. On the left, Harriet Anderson, no less, who will have quite a juicy part, even if it's not exactly as glamorous as her first role for Bergman, In Summer with Monica.
God dag, faster Elsa. Hur mår faster idag? Kan du tänka dig att vi har besök idag? Det är vilket besök?
Kom och hälsa nu, barnsmå, var inte rädda.
Min blivande hustru.
Bergman includes two androgynous characters in Fanny and Alexander. The first, here, the bishop's Aunt Elsa, is in fact played by a man. And the second, the young boy Ishmael, who we'll meet much later in Jacobi's household, is actually played by a woman. This kind of tableau pays tribute, one feels, to Carl Theodor Dreyer and the tradition of whiteness and plainness and regularity of line in Scandinavian design and architecture. If you go on vacation to Scandinavia, you'll see many church interiors like this. Their whitewashed walls and their square casements and an overwhelming odour of sanctity. The concept behind such churches flowed from Lutheranism, which swept through Scandinavia during the 16th century and which preached a puritanical approach to daily life. It's not unlike the Protestant tradition in my own country, Scotland, where the preacher and reformer John Knox followed the stern doctrines of Calvin as well as Luther and believed in total austerity and intolerance. This is a kind of exaggerated version of Bergman's own upbringing in his father's vicarage in Stockholm. Fanny and Alexander reveals, I believe, that the reality of that childhood lay somewhere between the cheerful family atmosphere of the Ekdal mansion and the unrelenting severity of the bishop's palace. It calls for a harsh regime, and Emily's eyes show how appalled she is at the prospect, even if, rationally, she knows that she's in thrall to the bishop's personality, and that there is no retreat.
Redan tänkt. För mig är ingen svårighet att uppfylla din önskan.
But it's an environment in which punishment lingers just around the corner. I remember visiting the fishing village in the north of Scotland where my father's family came from. And when my father asked if adultery was a common occurrence, his thin-lipped cousin replied, "Och, there was a woman did that once, but we stained her ut of tune. We stoned her out of town." And it's very similar in this Swedish ecclesiastical setting. Perhaps Emily has not been so blissfully happy with poor Oscar as earlier scenes have suggested. After all, Bergman's mother, Anna Åkerblom, seemed also to yearn for something more fulfilling than the daily round of a clergyman's wife.
Kyss mig nu och håll mig i din famn alldeles stilla så som bara du kan, min älskling.
This marriage ceremony, which is normally such a joyful occasion, is almost a confrontation between two families, each lined up and regarding the other in a mood of armed neutrality. For the Ekdal family, the tone of the ceremony is one of farewell to Emily and the children, and Alexander will be overwhelmed by his sadness at what he clearly regards as a betrayal. This priest is a familiar face too from Swedish films. He's played by Hans Struth, who was a successful young actor during the 1940s and had a small part in Bergman's 1948 movie Port of Call, and then played a photographer in Smiles of a Summer Night.
Jag, Elisabeth Emily Josefin Ekdal.
Jag, Elisabeth Emily Josefin Ekdal.
Tager dig, Olof Henrik Edvard Vergerus.
And as Alexander once again sees his father's ghost, we realize that the marriage is taking place not in a church but within the Ekdal family apartments. Bergman's father presided over many such ceremonies, and weddings and funerals formed an essential part of the texture of Ingmar's earliest days. As he writes in his memoirs, quote, "Childhood in the grace and favour parsonage of Sophia Hemmet, the everyday rhythm, birthdays, church festivals, Sundays, duties, games, freedom, conformity and security," unquote. And related to that, he says, "The prerogative of childhood is to move unhindered between magic and oatmeal porridge, between boundless terror and explosive joy," unquote.
Är det bra det här nu då?
Du såg ju hur lycklig hon var, den kära Emil.
Jag tänker på barn.
De vänjer sig nog, kära mamma.
Now the ceremony is over, and the Ekdals come to terms with the new state of affairs.
Det där har du ingen aning om, kära Karl.
Jag vet inte varför, jag bara vill gråta.
De borde verkligen ha kostat på sig en bröllopsresa.
And so Emily Ekdal and Alexander and Fanny walk away ominously and inexorably into a new way of life, led pompously and remorselessly by this Pied Piper of a bishop.
Hans mor var i alla fall förtjusande.
Systern, det var en satans ragata.
Jag känner på mig att vi får Emily tillbaka. Ganska snart.
I've said that Bergman's portrayal of the grimmer aspects of the children's life is a kind of revenge on his own childhood. Or perhaps exorcism would be a better way of explaining this type of scene.
Barnen tycks inte ha någon aptit. De är oroade av allt nytt och ovant. Det måste du förstå, Henrietta. Det kanske är så att de missaktar det goda brödet och den smakliga födan.
Certainly Bergman's mother and father, while caricatured to some extent in the Ekdal sequence and here, were hyper-controlled in their relations with each other. And beneath this rigid decorum, Bergman could always sense the tremendous tension that lay between them, and a sort of undeclared aggression.
Käraste Henrietta, det är faktiskt jag som bestämmer över mina barn.
This suppression of true feelings, especially when punishing the children, meant that life had to be conducted in a state of absolute objectivity. As a result, Bergman's villains have always been devoid of feeling. In a sense, these people are trapped.
Förlåt mig, kära Emilia. Jag glömmer mig, förlåt. Du är säkert en mycket duktigare husmor. Jag tänker fråga dig till råds i allt. Edvard har förmanat mig minst 100 gånger.
The way that Henrietta collapses in tears suggests a mask falling aside for a few moments. She is trying desperately to maintain this austere demeanor, as she's been taught to do, but she cannot. And the plight of the bishop's aunt, unable to articulate, unable to control her limbs, becomes a grotesque and silent metaphor for the immobility of life at the bishop's palace.
Något som jag kanske får lov att berätta är att vi morgontid är här i huset. Såväl vardag som söndag. 6:00 samlas vi till morgonbön i Edvards arbetsrum. Jag vill också nämna att vi bäddar våra sängar och städar våra rum själva. I det här huset härskar punktlighet, renlighet och ordning.
Bli inte förskräckta nu, barnsmå. Min dotter menar inte så illa som det kanske låter.
Bergman films Emily in solitary close-up, with her head almost pressed against the grey-white wall behind her, like some specimen pinned down on a board. In his memoirs, Bergman wrote, quote, "Most of our upbringing was based on such concepts as sin, confession, punishment, forgiveness and grace, concrete factors in relationships between children and parents and God. There was an innate logic in all this which we accepted and thought we understood. This fact may well have contributed to our astonishing acceptance of Nazism. We had never heard of freedom and knew even less what it tasted like. In a hierarchical system, all doors are closed." End quote.
Och nu ber vi aftonbön.
And now Bergman deliberately reminds us of the contrast between the ritual of going to bed in the chilly, barely furnished rooms of their new home and the rich, happy mood of bedtime in the Ekdal household. A paradise that must seem half a lifetime away for Alexander and Fanny now. In both rituals, prayers are said, but here the prayers seem more like a sanction than a cheerful duty.
Justina, det är ett par saker som jag skulle vilja tala med dig om morgondagens.
So another little duel looms up between the bishop and Alexander.
Vad läser du för bok, Alexander?
Alexander truculent and unwilling to exchange any small talk with someone he regards as a kind of Lucifer, a mortal enemy who didn't quite actually kill his beloved father, but instead is sadistically and methodically erasing the memory of that father. The bishop shows his physical strength to Alexander in a gesture that's described by Bergman in the screenplay as a caress that's more like a box on the ears, and discovers his bear. And anyone who's ever cherished one of those soft toys will feel a pang of sympathy for Alexander as the bishop decides whether or not to confiscate the creature. How long one keeps those first cuddly toys. I think I kept mine until I was in my late teens. I didn't go to bed with it that late, but I can remember moving from my parents' house and being reluctant to throw Bunny, as I called him, out with the other trash. The bishop comes out with all these glib homilies, such as love cannot be commanded, but he's unable to project the love himself. He's a prisoner of his own convictions.
Vad är det här för ett dockskåp?
För 15 år sedan bodde 2 små flickor i det här rummet. De drunknade ner i floden tillsammans med sin mor.
Now will come the revelation that the bishop was married previously, and that his 2 children drowned with their mother. Immediately one wonders, was it suicide? Were they deliberately left to drown? What is this skeleton, or what are these skeletons in the cupboard? In the screenplay, there's a 3rd child in these scenes who does not appear in the film as it was shot. Her name is Amanda, and she is 12 years old to Alexander's 10 and Fanny's 8. Bergman did have an elder brother, but he clearly decided not to include him as a character in the film. Bergman himself is, of course, clearly subsumed into the personality of Alexander, but his alter ego by name, Putta, is actually the son of Gustav Adolf Ekdal, and appears, as we've seen, in the earlier nursery scenes. Poor Christian Almgren, who was only 10 when he played Putta, died in an apartment fire in 1994.
Spela inte Hamlet nu, min gosse. Jag är inte drottning Gertrud, och din snälla styvfar är inte kung av Danmark.
Emily, knowing that Alexander had been so impressed by that rehearsal of Hamlet when his father fell ill, takes the bull by the horns and challenges him in effect, saying that she's not the hateful person that Alexander thinks she is right now.
Jävla skit. Kom, ska få se något, Fanny.
And confirmation that they are indeed in effect in prison is revealed by the bars on the windows.
Galler utanför fönstren. Öppna.
I'll return after the intermission for part 2 of Fanny and Alexander. Who made his one and only foray into film music with his work on Fanny and Alexander. This is the summer villa of the Ekdal family. And Bergman, I think, is deliberately contrasting it with the villa in Wild Strawberries. Both places represent the summer refuge for well-off, middle-class Swedish families a century ago. But the rain and the absence of Emily and her children give this scene a melancholy tinge, heightened by little extras like the chiming of the clock. There's a palpable sense of death, and in the presence of Oscar's ghost, there's the very definite sense of another dimension. In that close-up, he looks very much as Bergman's father, Erik, must have done. Eric Bergman was tall, he was always well-groomed, and he was good-looking in a Scandinavian type of way. Women always wanted to do things for Eric Bergman, especially during his later years. The same applied to Ingmar himself. An actress once told me that when he's talking to someone he likes, Bergman seems to focus exclusively and almost hypnotically on that individual, dissolving any antagonism or resentment. In spite of all the battles with his father, in spite of that side of his father which he illustrates so chillingly in the character of the bishop, Bergman came to terms with his parents as time went by. He told Jörn Donner, for example, during the 70s, that, quote, "Gradually I managed to regard my parents not as parents, but as people. They weren't a frightening, threatening concept for me, but just absolutely ordinary people. I began to feel some tenderness for them." Unquote.
Jag tyckte om att vara tjock om magen. Jag struntade i hjärtans hjärna i teatern. Alltsammans är förresten roller.
We haven't said much about Alan Edwall, who plays Oscar. He was a singular figure in Swedish theatre and cinema. He grew up in a very poor family. His father was a trade union leader, and throughout his life, Alan Edwall sought to improve the lot of ordinary people. In the final years of his life, he started his own theatre, which he ran from top to bottom until his death in 1997, even taking the tickets at the door. He began appearing for Bergman in 1959, when he played the beggar in The Virgin Spring. Then, because he had a flair for comedy, he played the ear demon in The Devil's Eye. But his most enigmatic part was in Winter Light as the hunchback Algot Frøvik, a kind of Christ figure struggling with the problem of pain. Later, he appeared in that other Bergman comedy, All These Women. Jan Troell knew how to use his talents so very brilliantly, and Edwall had a big part in The Emigrants. I always remember the way he reflects on the passage of time in Troell's Here's Your Life. He stares out of the window and says, "Aye, life's like a pat of butter on a hot stove. One hiss and it's gone." Edwall directed some films himself. His feature, Oka and His World, was screened at various American universities during the late 80s and was a very poignant recreation of the 1930s in the Swedish countryside. Now, for the first time, the ghost begins to speak, and he sends his message through time and space.
Jag oroar mig. Du oroar dig för barnen. Ja.
Det är kvällsmat.
Harriet Anderson had been reconciled to a more middle-aged type of role. She's never clung to a fading glamour. She was almost 20 when she made Summer with Monica. It wasn't her first screen role, but it did launch her on a versatile career. She came from a working-class district, Söder, that part of Stockholm to the south of the old town. And she's never had the slightest pretension about her significance as an actress. I've been with her at film festivals, where she has shocked some people at formal dinners by drinking from a champagne bottle or telling a dirty joke. She and Bergman enjoy a very enduring friendship. They had a hectic affair at the time of Summer with Monica, and they lived together in Malmö when Bergman was directing there. But this severe look of Harriet Anderson's was exploited by her later companion, Jörn Donner, in a series of films in the 1960s. And Bergman, of course, had given her two demanding roles a decade apart. The first was Karin in Through a Glass Darkly, and then 10 years later as the dying Agnes in Cries and Whispers. And here we are, a further 10 years on, and she's in another film of Bergman's. The vibrant sexual appeal has given way to a contained spirit of independence, a mistrust not so much of life as of anybody who tries to pull the wool over her eyes. Harriet was tempted to work abroad for a while during the 60s, and she featured in some German films. She also appeared opposite James Mason in The Deadly Affair, adapted from an early thriller by John le Carré. In 2003, she also had a part in Lars von Trier's Dogville.
Det finns inga spöken.
Ja, men bevara det, men varför vill jag skrämma någon? Men man mår ju inte riktigt bra i det här huset, inte? Titta här. Titta på min hand. Skinnet är alldeles bortslitet, bortfrätt. Röda köttet.
Here she talks about the kind of stigmata which shouldn't be taken metaphorically. I think it just implies that the obsession with religion in the bishop's household has reached a point where the flesh is mutilated, just as flagellants would lash themselves during the Middle Ages. In fact, there's a brief dream sequence conjured up by Isaac later in the TV version of Fanny and Alexander, a scene that emphasizes once more Justina's wounded palms. At this juncture, the children are fascinated by Justina. Perhaps they trust her as being the most approachable of the servants in the bishop's home. Certainly we do, and we think she's probably going to help the children in some way. But there's a menacing aspect to the way Bergman films her, looking slightly up at her face here, as he does at death in The Seventh Seal, or at other sinister figures throughout his cinema. So she does appear as a harbinger of bad things. She fixes the children with her dark gaze, as a witch might ensnare her prey.
Jag hade just varit till biblioteket hos den där mannen som är gift med min mor.
So once again, Alexander loves spinning tales from the vivid fabric of his imagination.
Jag gick genom matsalen.
And once again, it's the youthful Ingmar Bergman who's resurrected here. Someone who as a child beguiled his little sister Margareta with tall tales. And that's why in adult life he was able to produce such a fertile range of plots and situations. He's never ceased to have a flood of ideas for stories, something that most writers lack and have to work to elaborate. But nothing is impossible in Bergman's world, so his imagination knows no bounds. Magic actually exists for him, and as Tubal laughs in The Magician, life is a perfect performance of magic with continually new and startling effects.
Hon sa åt mig med svag, nästan ohörbar röst. Att jag inte skulle vara rädd. Att hon hade något att berätta.
There he's perhaps beginning to calculate a little, obviously. And to lay over the story of the dead children and their mother his own interpretation, based on his imprisonment in this same barred room. Such is the force of Alexander's personality, that not only does Justina start to believe in what he's saying, but we too begin to feel that Alexander may be endowed with special powers, some ability to bring about change. This is where the influence of E.T.A. Hoffmann starts to dominate the film, and we're reminded of Mozart's Magic Flute and Tamino's descent into the darkness in search of redemption. Perhaps it's also worth noting that Alexander's fib about his mother selling him to a circus was taken straight from Bergman's own school memories. He told a pal in his class that his mother had arranged for him to be sold to a circus. And when the teacher found out, he wrote an agitated letter to Bergman's mother. There was all hell to pay, both in class and at home.
Först under vattnet fick jag tag i mina barns händer och drog dem till mig.
I said earlier that in a way, Mai is a surrogate mother to Alexander. And this is underlined by the conversation she now has with Helena Ekdahl. Mai has been installed in her coffee shop, as Gustav Adolf had promised. But it's clearly a strain to keep going, and furthermore, she is quite evidently pregnant, a fact that the well-bred Helena does not remark on as she praises Mai's dress.
Något på tok.
Jag är kanske dum som oroar mig.
Kom så sätter vi oss här i trappen.
Du oroar dig för barnen.
But it's the children that concern her so passionately. Today, she would be talking to them constantly by cell phone or sending them text messages. But the phone was used sparingly in those far-off days, and then only by the wealthy. Letters were the norm. And the only good news here is that at least Alexander seems to have received the many notes sent to the bishop's home by Mai.
Tack för dina brev. Jag ska skriva när jag får tid.
In fact, speaking of phones reminds me to talk a little about the differences between the long and short versions of Fanny and Alexander. For one of the scenes cut out in this section of the film is a phone conversation between Helena and Isak, the Erland Josephson character, which doesn't amount to much, but does prepare the ground for Isak's intervention in the fate of the children later on. As with scenes from a marriage, there's a continuing debate about the respective merits of the theatrical and TV versions of Fanny and Alexander. Bergman originally planned the film to be shown on TV in 5 episodes, though not all of equal length, and to be screened in theatres at around 2.5 hours. The TV version ran, including the epilogue, to over 5 hours. This had been cut down from some 25 hours of film shot during the production period. Bergman believes that the TV series could still use a further 30 to 40 minutes of cuts, but he stands foursquare behind the extended version, which is available in the Criterion Special Edition box set of Fanny and Alexander. The theatrical release was drastically cut, and Bergman eventually whittled it down from 240 minutes to 188. The contrast is stark between the way the maid, Mai, exits through the garden door, and then Justina, the maid in the other household, comes in. They are like night and day. Mai represents goodness, and Justina represents malevolence. The pace during this part of the film quickens almost imperceptibly, and the suspense tightens because Bergman and his editor, Sylvia Ingemarsson, have rejigged the material to make the film work better in a theatrical context. For example, the scene we've watched earlier with Oscar's ghost appearing before Helena Ekdahl is inserted after Justina has told the bishop about Alexander's fantasy.
No.
But at the same time, Bergman has eliminated a short scene in which Alexander and Fanny focus all their thoughts on bringing death to the bishop. "Die, you devil," hisses Alexander as they sit together at the window. Like the bishop's, Justina's malevolence is all the more worrying because it's concealed beneath a veil of good manners, even obsequiousness. Her humility is as fake as Mai's seems genuine. It's certainly light years away from the giggling, seductive maid that Harriet played in Smiles of a Summer Night. The bishop seems preoccupied with his flute playing. It's as though music is the only refuge for this vicious, troubled spirit. Possibly he lives more in music than he does in his relationships with other people. The satisfied look on Justina's face as he reacts to her story about the children is an extraordinarily revealing moment.
Justina kan gå.
And that lightning flash, although very theatrical, actually works because it suggests a presence of some kind of spell. A spell that's begun to take hold within the bishop.
Vem är där?
Det är bara jag.
Emily.
And so Emily is reunited with her mother-in-law. Now, at the height of the storm, we begin one of the film's most harrowing passages, running a full 10 minutes, as the children are roused from bed by the bishop's implacable mother.
Skynda på då!
Alexander, min gosse.
And the bishop opens what can only be described as a trial. It's the trial of Alexander, and Bergman films it in the same way as he would a courtroom sequence elsewhere, with alternating close-ups of prosecutor, witnesses and accused.
Hon talade till honom. Hon sa att hennes make, ers högvärdighet biskopen i vredesmod, hade låst in henne och barnen i dåvarande sängkammaren utan vare sig mat eller vatten.
Right away, there's an interesting point to be made, which has occurred earlier in the film, and I haven't commented on it. At that period, in such circles, people would address each other in the third person, particularly when a servant was addressing his or her master or mistress, or when a client was addressing an attorney. So Justina is saying in Swedish that Alexander claimed that the bishop did such and such. She never says that you did such and such. Children are the exception. The bishop can talk to Alexander with the intimate du or you. But this third-person business is a significant mark of respect, and perhaps fear. The form actually creates a barrier between people during a conversation.
Vill du komma fram hit till bordet, Alexander? Är du beredd att gå ed på din utsago?
Everything is built around religion in this household. And Bergman himself obviously went through this kind of trial, the procedural nature of it making the whole experience that much more frightening.
Lägg din vänstra hand på Bibeln och säg efter mig. Jag, Alexander Ekdal.
Jag, Alexander Ekdal.
For a moment, as we hear these responses intoned, we think almost of the marriage ceremony between the bishop and Emily, which had a kind of ghastly finality about it.
Och kommer att säga.
Att allt jag sagt, säger och kommer att säga.
Är den rena sanningen.
Är den rena sanningen.
Alexander, min gosse. Du minns att du och jag hade ett angeläget samtal för ungefär ett år sedan. Det gällde vissa moralfrågor.
Here in a second, we'll hear Alexander using that third person, and using it almost with pleasure.
Biskopen talade och Alexander teg.
Teg och skämdes kanske för sina lögner.
Jag har blivit klokare sedan dess.
Even though they are separated by only a few inches, they might as well be on either side of a wall. Again, this physical violation, the chilling way in which the bishop seizes Alexander's neck, almost wanting to wring it, but at the same time trying to exploit the good cop, bad cop principle. One moment soft and ingratiating, the next moment ruthless and bearing down on his victim, very much like death in the seventh seal. In fact, the way that Jan Malmsjö stares at his prey and tries to will him to confess reminds me very much of Bengt Ekeröd's technique when he played Death in The Seventh Seal. And if you check the DVD of that Bergman classic, you'll find exactly this kind of baleful gaze in the chess scenes or inside the confessional when the knight talks to death.
Det vill säga den kärlek jag hyser för dig. Och din mor och din syster. Är inte blind och inte mjäkig.
Nobody does close-ups better than Bergman. I think I've said this in previous commentaries, but it bears repeating because here the close-ups are enormous, inescapable. Bergman said that we show masks to the world, and the bishop's mask is his immaculate cassock and his dignified bearing. But the close-up probes behind this pretension to locate the cruelty that lies within.
Jag är nämligen mycket starkare än du.
Det betvivlar jag inte alls.
Jag menar andligen starkare. Därför att jag har sanningen och rättvisan på min sida. Alexander.
When Fanny and Alexander came out in early 1983, the distinguished British critic Philip French wrote that the Ekdal sequences are framed and lit to evoke the geometric composition and shadowless, all-over light of Carl Larsson, Sweden's most perennially popular artist, who celebrated the attractions of middle-class family life at the turn of the century. But the scenes in the bishop's palace have none of the sumptuous colour and furnishing of the Ekdal scenes.
Jag har glömt vad det är jag ska bekänna.
Ja, så är det så.
Vad vill biskopen att Alexander ska
Du
bekänna?
vet att jag har medel till mitt förfogande.
Det visste jag inte, men nu vet jag det.
Du förstår att i min barndom så var man inte så hjärtnupen. För då hade vi rottingen och den vi så här också.
This could be a composition from Dreyer or Vermeer, with the mother sewing, the maid immobile, head bent in phony shame. Witnesses, and yet unwilling and unable to intervene and alter the outcome of this trial.
När man har tagit ett par klonkar av det här. Och hjälpte inte det, så hade vi en ganska mörk och kall skrubb.
This is a reference to the closet where Bergman used to be shut up after he had transgressed against the rules of his parents' home. The reality may just have been worse than the fiction, because Bergman told me that he was sometimes forced to parade in a red girl's dress if he'd been particularly naughty, and that kind of punishment would seem just too far-fetched on screen.
Men snart är du en vuxen man, Alexander. Och livet straffar lögner utan kärlek och hänsyn.
And so the pressure builds relentlessly.
Straffet ska lära dig att älska sanningen.
Until all of a sudden Alexander will cave in. He'll suddenly see that it's more expedient, more pragmatic to confess and take his punishment and move on to the next step, rather than be sucked even further into this vortex of hatred. What hypocrisy, when it's the bishop who's thinking, now it's I who has won a great victory. But he turns it around and now gets down to business.
Men vilket straff väljer du? Rottingen, resinoljan eller mörka skrubben?
Hur många slag får jag av rottingen?
10 slag, varken mer eller mindre.
Då väljer jag rottingen.
The cane was only recently banned in most British schools. I attended a boarding school in Surrey where caning was part of the regimen. The worst thing, if I recall rightly, was not so much being caned as giving the cane. The system was that when you were young, in your early teens, you tended to be punished for some misdemeanour, and you'd be thrashed by a senior prefect. Never 10 strokes, though. I think there were 6 maximum at my school, although that was bad enough. Also, you didn't have to take your trousers down, so if you stuffed newspaper down your backside before you went to the prefect's room, it didn't hurt so much. When I was 18 years old and head of my house, I remember having to cane a boy who'd done something wrong in front of all my fellow prefects, and that I found incredibly difficult to do. And I remember not caning with full force so as not to hurt the unfortunate youngster. Anyway, you can see all that kind of thing in Lindsay Anderson's masterpiece If, which is set in a British boarding school. And this ritual punishment is not by any means limited to Britain or Northern Europe. You'll find it, for example, near the beginning of Chen Kai-ger's Chinese film Farewell My Concubine.
Jag ber aldrig om förlåtelse.
Du ber inte om förlåtelse.
Nej.
Lägg dig fram, stup, Alexander.
This is utterly in character too. That Alexander would be bold until he realizes that he really is going to be caned a second time and he can't take the pain of the humiliation anymore. So it isn't just punishment, it's also humiliation. And Bergman has recalled that he was always babbling out excuses right, left and centre during his childhood. It's the fundamental humiliation of one human being by another.
Alexander ber biskopen om förlåtelse.
För lögnerna och meneden.
För lögnen och meneden.
Du förstår väl att jag har straffat dig av kärlek?
Ja!
Kyss min hand, Alexander.
Får jag gå och lägga mig nu?
Ja, det får du.
And this avuncular arm, which seems so comforting, but in fact resembles a serpent's embrace.
Så ska du sova på vinden. Justina kommer att ordna med en madrass och en filt.
One final cry of defiance before Alexander is banished to the attic.
George högvärdighet!
And his sister faithfully shrinks away when the bishop tries to caress her.
Nu måste jag gå. En vagn väntar där uppe vid grinden. Jag är rädd att det har hänt något medan jag varit där.
So Emily is now talking to her mother-in-law, and the scene has been dramatically shortened by comparison with the full version for TV.
Han förstår inte att han
There's the revelation that she's pregnant, which makes it twice in a few hours that Helena has heard about another grandchild, first Mai and now Emily. But she jumps straight into this declaration about trying to get a divorce. Whereas in the longer version she says, "I don't know how a man can live with so much hate. I saw nothing, I was too dense. He spoke to me of another life, a life of demands, of purity, of joy, and the performance of duty. I'd never heard such words. There seemed to be a light around him when he talked to me. At the same time, I saw that he was lonely, that he was unhappy, haunted by fear and bad dreams. He assured me that I would save him. He said that together with the children, we would live a life in God's nearness, in the truth." That was the most important, I think, what he said about the truth. I was so thirsty. It sounds dramatic and overstrung, Helena, I know, but I can't find any other word. I thirsted for the truth. End quote. Now that speech explains, I think, the background to all this. Why she first became enamored of the bishop, and why now she hates him so much that she could almost kill him. Only Liv Ullmann, among Bergman's actresses, has such remarkably imposing eyes. Eva Fröhling's are so blue that they dominate every close-up. And now, looking almost like Catherine Deneuve in Belle de Jour, she goes off to her carriage. And as it drives away with its dark horses, you have a sense that it's almost like a funeral carriage, reminiscent, perhaps, of that opening dream in Wild Strawberries.
Ge mig nyckeln! Edvard har förbjudit. Nu ger du mig nyckeln!
Finally, Emily is willing to resort to violence too, to see her children, having heard that Alexander is locked in the attic. She climbs up into this strange, lofty room, where the sighing of the wind makes it seem even more desolate and cut off from the rest of the bishop's home. At this point in the TV version, Bergman shows another of Alexander's magical hallucinations. The dead children of the bishop appear to him in the attic, confirming what he's heard about their death by drowning. This is a composition that has overtones of the Pietà, the dead Christ supported by the Virgin Mary, an image that Bergman dwelt on so movingly in Cries and Whispers, when Kari Silwan cradles Harriet Anderson with similar tenderness. And Emily shows real affection for her children, perhaps for the first time. Bergman cuts back to the other side of the coin, to the rowdy, exuberant Ekdal life, which comes straight from those summer days in the Stockholm archipelago that Bergman remembers from his own vanished youth. The same white suits and white dresses as one finds in Wild Strawberries, or, as I pointed out a little earlier, in the paintings of Carl Larsson. Gustav Adolf, or Gusten as his mother calls him affectionately, is in fine spirits, ready for another glass of punch. Jarl Kulla may have had his finest hour as Count Malcolm in Smiles of a Summer Night. He may not have been bearded in those days, but his hair was sleeker and he had the same easy-going arrogance and genial good cheer which enabled him to dominate any scene in which he appeared. I also felt he was perfectly cast as the fastidious music critic in All These Women, a comedy that misfired for Bergman in the early 60s. Helena is sorting her photographs, rather as old Mrs. Armfeldt plays solitaire in her mansion in Smiles of a Summer Night. All of these Bergman films are interrelated if you probe deep enough. You could also say that Helena Ekdal is an actress, and rather like a retired version of Desiree Armfeldt in Smiles. She's a mother as well as an actress, just like Desiree. And in yet another parallel, Jarl Kulla has a wife and a mistress in both this film and in Smiles of a Summer Night.
Den här damen i dekolletaget minns jag mycket bra. Det är en av pappas väninnor.
Du misstar dig, min vän. Vi var elevkamrater. Hon gifte sig med en greve Ekenstierna och fick 12 barn och blev stor som ett hus.
Jag har alltid beundrat mammas suveräna handlag med pappas äventyrligheter.
Throughout both versions of Fanny and Alexander, Bergman is striving to keep this delicate balance between the two moods, the two patterns of life, so that the film becomes neither too frivolous nor too gloomy. All this harmless bickering serves as a perfect counterpoint to the tragedy that's unfolding with Emily and her children at the bishop's palace. I think Bergman has transplanted his vision of the ideal family, which for many years he felt had escaped him personally in childhood, into his working environment. He's created a family of actors and actresses, technicians and administrators, who stay with him through the years. And when he's making films or directing plays, he really accepts his collaborators as one big family. He's smart enough to know that at the end of the day, it is he who's responsible for everything. As he said in an interview during the filming of Fanny and Alexander, and I quote, "When directing a film, you always say we're one big family, we all love each other, we're together. And in a way that's true. But in another sense, you're totally isolated. There's the crew, over here are the actors, and here stands the director. And he makes all the decisions. He makes about 10,000 decisions every day. And he knows that 50% of those decisions will be bad ones. Only a very small percentage will be good decisions." Unquote.
Det finns inte minst anledning att ta mig i försvar emot mig. Nu håller av henne. Alma håller av henne. Hon är ju älskad på samma sätt som Jenny, Petra och Putte. Ja, inte precis på samma sätt, men nästan. Hon är snäll mot mig. Hon tycker inte jag är fet och gammal och äcklig. Ja, det är ingen som tycker förresten.
This is also Bergman speaking, because he's famous for this quote that the theatre is my wife and film is my mistress. And in many of his films, there is this contrast between the wife and the mistress and the attitudes of the man towards both of them. Bergman himself has sometimes been in a similar situation too, and so the monologue flung out by Jarl Kulla comes very much from the heart. When I asked Bergman if he still believed in that theatre is my wife and film is my mistress business, he said no, now I just live in bigamy.
Du gör så fan, Helle, kom nu! Ja, jag är fullkomligt lugn. Det är du som skriker och bråkar och jag vill ha slut på det här puttlandet mellan dig och mamma.
So Helena is left alone with her photographs and her memories. I like the moment here when she turns the pages and comes to a spread where the pictures seem to have been removed. One wonders where they are, what they were, and if perhaps they were of Oscar, her late husband, or maybe of Emily and the children. I think this skeleton of the animal in the water is rather a crude portent, and I do believe that Bergman does overdo the symbolism a bit in Fanny and Alexander. That storm with all its theatrical thunder and lightning in the scenes we've just been watching, and the bars on the window are a little too stressed. But these are small flaws in the overall picture. So begins the most dramatic section of the film, with Isak Jacobi hurtling through the streets in his brash, noisy cart. We don't know why he's coming to the bishop's palace, although in the TV version there is a brief phone conversation between him and Helena during the storm, in which she expresses her concerns about Emily and the children, and that might explain why Isak has been prompted to do what he's about to do. Of course, being Jewish and being a merchant, he's intensely disliked by the church and its representatives. The bishop's sister, especially.
God dag, herr Jacobi.
God dag, fröken Bergerus. Jag hoppas att...
Vad gäller saken?
Jag undrar om hans högvärdighet biskopen möjligen...
Han skriver predikan och får inte störas.
The austerity of this decor, no carpets on the stairs, no carpets on the floor, just harsh flagstones. This decor is deliberately contrasted with the relaxed opulence of the Ekdal apartments and of the family's summer home.
För några månader sedan, noga räknat i november, var hans högvärdighet vänlig nog att föreslå mig en liten affär.
It's a masterstroke to have Erland Josephson standing on that first step, because he's able to bend forward in the obsequious way that Jacobi likes to trade on. He knows he's loathed by these Lutherans, but he knows also that he's the man with the money.
Jag ska vara uppriktig, herr Jacobi. Jag tycker att ni är en obehaglig människa. Jag har varken tid eller lust att inlåta mig på ett samtal med er. Farväl, herr Jacobi.
En penningförlägenhet.
Förlåt?
Er bror, hans högvärdighet, biskopen, befann sig i penningförlägenhet. Kan jag sätta mig?
Inte där.
I said earlier that Fanny and Alexander was, by Bergman's own admission, strongly influenced by the writing of E.T.A. Hoffmann, the German author born in the same year as America declared independence, and whose last initial stood for Amadeus in tribute to Mozart. Hoffmann was known for his macabre tales and for his very sinister characters. Tchaikovsky based the Nutcracker ballet suite on a tale by Hoffmann. And Coppelia, the ballet by Delibes, also came from a Hoffmann story, as did Wagner's The Meistersingers. I want to say something about Hoffmann and the supernatural, because Bergman, throughout his career, has been fascinated by magic, or drawn to it. If we go back to 1946, at the very outset of his career, to a film called It Rains on Our Love, there's a mysterious man with an umbrella who seems to come like a good spirit to bless the lives of the young couple who are in all kinds of trouble in that film. Then, in 1950, Bergman made the very beautiful, very lyrical masterpiece, Summer Interlude. There he used a ballet master wearing the makeup of Dr. Coppelius, straight from Hoffmann's story. He used this sinister character to give advice to the ballerina at the heart of the film. 8 years later, in The Magician, Max von Sydow played a thinly disguised version of Anton Mesmer, the 19th century magnetist, half charlatan, half genuine hypnotist. Then, in Hour of the Wolf, made in 1967, Bergman included a lot of references to the occult, and to the magic flute in particular, with a corpse that comes to life, and one character who even walks up the wall and across the ceiling, in front of Max von Sydow's startled gaze. Bergman's films of the 70s tended to be more naturalistic in tone. But here in Fanny and Alexander, the mood becomes very weird and mysterious, exactly as in the tales of Hoffmann. And as we'll see in a minute or two, the Jacobi household is stuffed with puppets and various gadgets, again evocative of Hoffmann's world.
Naturligtvis, om ers högvärdighet ger mig sitt värderade namn på kontraktet, inte sant?
Ni ursäktar kanske att jag avlägsnar mig.
Jag kommer att sakna er, fröken Bergerus.
Jag förutsätter att ni inte tar mer annat än det som tillkommer er.
Misstankar återfaller på den som tänker dem.
Now he rushes upstairs to get the children, while the bishop counts his money. There's a black cat on the right, which means bad luck in the United States and good luck in Britain for some reason. It was the witch hunts in Salem that started the concept of a black cat bringing misfortune, because the cats belonging to the so-called witches were often hung or burned along with them. Clearly in Sweden it means bad luck in spades. And like a magician concealing his rabbit, Isak instantly is able to show the apparently empty chest to the bishop.
Vad sägs om tavlan, profeten där?
Ett vackert och dyrbart arbete.
Skulle den intressera?
Beklagar mina resurser för ögonblicket en smula ansträngda. Hur står det till med biskopinnan?
Tack för den vänliga frågan.
So this politeness between the two continues, but one has a feeling that the bishop's facade is about to crack. One doubts that this letter will reach its destination. And now he does explode, spewing forth his racism and loathing of the Ekdal family and everything to do with it.
Det här ska du ångra in på benknotorna! Ditt vedervärdiga kroknästa! Lugna dig! Det där svinet försöker stjäla mina barn! Nej, det kan han inte. Jag har nyckeln till barnkammaren.
Here comes a moment of pure magic, when by sheer force of personality and projection of energy, Isak projects the children back into the nursery, or rather, an image of the children. And we realize that Emily is here in the room, perhaps all the time, heavily pregnant, and indeed looking weak from the heat and suffocating mood of her prison. The bishop somehow realizes that he's been duped. But, like Dr. Vigeris in The Magician, he can't quite put his finger on it. The look exchange between Emily and Isak is one of complicity and satisfaction. Now the children are safely installed in Isak Jacobi's home, and we learn that Aaron is not just an assistant, but also a relative of Isak's.
Aron, kom. Här är min systerson Aron. Ja. Och så till bords.
It's almost as though Isak were living inside a theatre, packed with hundreds of props. This set, with its sinuous corridors and rooms in a state of shambles, is a production designer's delight, or nightmare.
Jag har utfört allt som morbror beordrade.
We've seen Aaron before. He's played, as I've said, by Bergman's son, Mats. Like Francis Ford Coppola, Bergman has offered jobs to members of his family at various stages of their careers. Mats's twin sister, Anna, appeared earlier as Hannah, the young actress in the Ekdal family theatre. The director's last son, Daniel, was only 19 when Fanny and Alexander was shot, and he served as an assistant and jack of all trades on set. And Daniel's mother, Kebi Larete, plays the piano during that pre-Christmas gathering at the Ekdal's home. Finally, Bergman's fifth and last wife, Ingrid, was behind the scenes attending to all kinds of administrative chores.
Kom ihåg det, Alexander. Kom ihåg det, Fanny. Ibland sjunger han, också på nätterna.
This is the first time we've heard of Ishmael, and he'll prove an intriguing character for Alexander to meet. So the children have now experienced three distinct environments. First, the comfortable, reassuring home life at the Ekdal house. Then the ascetic, almost brutal regime at the bishop's. And now this very bizarre, mysterious habitat of Isak Jacobi's tucked away behind his store. You can tell that Jacobi is not exactly a parent, but he's the ideal uncle for any child to have. And Alexander's afraid to be left alone, especially after his traumatic life at the bishop's. At least he managed to bring his beloved teddy bear.
Jag heter Aron. Min bror heter Ismael. Våra föräldrar dog när vi var små.
He's wondering what to make of Aaron's hissed remark that he and his brother were very young when their parents died. Wondering if his mother will survive her ordeal at the hands of the bishop, and whether he and Fanny might be condemned to grow up in this bizarre, cluttered house. I've said that Bergman had to cut out an enormous amount of material for the theatrical version to get it into a 3-hour package that could tell the story as effectively as a TV series does in 5 hours. Most of what he cut out is well worth seeing and actually makes the TV version much more of an organic whole. There are 2 major sequences dropped between the scene of Aran saying goodnight and Alexander going off for a pee. One of them is a genuine loss, I think, and the other actually wouldn't work in a movie theatre. It's when Isaac Jacobi tells the children an elaborate fairy tale, and he goes on and he talks of this and talks of that, reading from a book and then reciting from memory. It only comes to life when Alexander imagines one of the scenes in the fairy tale, a procession of flagellants marching through a kind of desert, with Harriet Anderson as Justina holding her lacerated palms up to the camera. Actually, that's the scene I saw being shot when I visited the set one Sunday afternoon. But it does drag on a bit, and I think Bergman was smart to cut the whole scene out for theatrical audiences. The second sequence to hit the cutting room floor was a long, tense, and often witty confrontation between the bishop and Emily's 2 brothers-in-law, Karl and Gustav Adolf. There the brothers threaten the bishop, saying he will under no circumstances retrieve the children, and further, if he doesn't agree to give Emily a divorce, they will expose him as a bankrupt, because Gustav Adolf has found out, probably from Isaac Jacobi, that he is in deep waters financially. Now that's a sequence that is significant for the film in terms of character, and makes the death of the bishop under pressure seem just that little bit more persuasive. Here we have, for the last time, another appearance by Oscar Ekdahl. Bergman's always sparing with music in his later films, but I think he uses that piano intervention very skillfully during the scene to give it an eerie atmosphere.
Det vore mycket bättre att du stack iväg till himlen, för du kan ju ändå inte hjälpa oss.
And in Alexander's replies, we can hear his disillusionment with the organized religion that he's been brought up with, which is now fatally contaminated by his experiences with the bishop.
Hela livet levde jag med er barn. Och Emily. Döden gör ingen skillnad.
Like many Bergman characters, Alexander questions the very existence of God.
Varför kan du inte gå till Gud och säga att han måste slå ihjäl biskopen? Eller är det så att Gud skiter i dig? Att han skiter i oss allihop? Har du överhuvudtaget sett Gud där på andra sidan? Ingen jävla har en tanke i huvudet. Nästan allihop idioter.
And now this is not the hand of the bishop, but the hand of his own father. Much gentler, more understanding. So we've now jumped forward in terms of the screenplay and the television version. We've jumped forward a considerable distance in time. We're now approaching the climax to the whole drama.
Ska du inte komma och lägga dig? Klockan har slagit 4.
Jag kan inte sova.
Emily wants to sleep, but one also suspects that she may have asked the bishop's sister for some sedative pills in order possibly to take an overdose.
Ja, han kommer imorgon bitti. Vad dricker du?
Varm buljong. Det hjälper mot sömnlöshet.
Får jag?
It's rather ambiguous, but she hands a drink to him in the knowledge, I think, that it will knock him out, and in a trice her thoughts of putting an end to her claustrophobic existence have switched into subduing him, so she can escape definitively from the bishop's grasp.
Denna plötsliga eftergivenhet, jag förstår den inte.
Drick medan det är varmt.
It also reminds us of the love potion administered to the young lovers by Tubal in The Magician, or the special wine offered by old Madame Armfelt in Smiles of a Summer Night. The bishop has changed. He's become much more submissive. He's no longer wearing the immaculate cassock. He looks dishevelled, and his hair is unkempt.
Sitt kvar du. Så jag går och tittar till henne.
He visits his ailing aunt and moves the oil lamp closer to her side when she complains that it's so dark, like Goethe on his deathbed when he said, "More light." And so this justifies what will happen at the end of the film. In Elsa, he probably sees a mirror image of his own state of soul.
Hur mycket är klockan?
Snart 4:30.
4:30 in the morning, the hour of the wolf for Bergman, the hour when most children are born and most people die. A time when, according to the ancient Romans, demons had a heightened power and vitality.
Du påstod en gång att du byter masker oavbrutet.
The bishop talks about masks and makes the intriguing comment that he has only one mask, and that is branded into his flesh. Bergman has built so many great scenes around this theme. He's often said that we all adopt masks to disguise our true feelings, our true nature to the world, and that without our mask we are naked and helpless. Gunnar Björnstrand's lawyer in Smiles of a Summer Night has his hair, moustache and beard cut in such a dramatic way that he might be a caricature. Albert Emanuel Vogler in The Magician has a long black beard and a wig that disguise him and that he can only remove in very private moments, far from the gaze of everyone. And it's when people talk of masks in Bergman that they refer to their real feelings. But the bishop's mask, whatever he says, is certainly being removed during these moments.
Jag är rädd för honom.
Bergman's most fruitful period was probably the mid-50s, when he was head of the municipal theatre in Malmö, the city in the south of Sweden. It was during those years that he perfected his powers of illusion, both on stage and in the cinema. Like Orson Welles, I think he regards the cinema as the best toy train set anyone could be given. This nice little joke with Aaron manipulating a huge puppet, pretending that he's God, and half deluding Alexander is an example of this. It's very reminiscent of the attic sequence at the end of The Magician, when Albert Emanuel Vogler, the charlatan, terrifies the skeptical doctor Vigerus, the same name as the bishop here, of course, and forces him to his knees. Even to that shot of the fingers coming round the door, which is also used in The Magician. Vogler's assistant, who's really his wife, another deception, declares earlier in The Magician, quote, "It's a game, nothing else. We use various kinds of apparatus, mirrors and projectors. It's very simple and entirely harmless," unquote. And on his side, Vigerus says, "Miracles don't happen. It's always the apparatus, the spiel, that has to do the work. The clergy have the same sad experience. God is silent and the people chatter." End quote. When Vigerus sneers at Vogler, the magician replies, "You're ungrateful. Haven't I exerted myself beyond my usual powers to give you an experience?" And there are echoes of that struggle in this much friendlier exchange between Aaron and Alexander, even to the words used by Aaron about his little trick. What it does is to usher us more into the realm of magic, or rather hocus pocus, and prepares us for the climax of the picture, which is based on magic, or at least on a belief in the supernatural. And Alexander, who's only 10 years old, is sufficiently susceptible to absorb all this, and to pick up on all the mysterious vibes floating around in this weird domain of Isaac Jacobis.
Ibland blir han rasande, då är han farlig.
Du sa att du hade varit uppe hela natten, men jag såg att du låg och sov i din morbrors sängkammare.
Det är mycket som är konstigt som man inte kan förklara. Det märker man särskilt när man sysslar med magi.
In Bergman's 1967 production, Hour of the Wolf, Not only is Ingrid Thulin found lying apparently dead like a mummy in the bowels of a castle and then coming to life, but we also have a terrifying moment when one of the demons in the film, played by Georg Rudeberg, actually manipulates a human puppet on a stage, a puppet that's been miniaturized. I know that sounds absurd if you haven't seen Hour of the Wolf, but it's no fantastic voyage. It really is a very chilling moment because it sufficiently beguiles us into accepting those images. And it's the same here as they approach the mummy. Bergman's art in the cinema is so close to the theatre, really, especially in his use of lighting. I remember when he brought Faust in 1959 to London, the whole theatre was plunged into darkness at the start, and suddenly a disembodied face seemed to go across the stage, and actually it was Max von Sydow's, and it was lit by a single spotlight, and that was a wonderfully theatrical effect. And here in this scene, the lighting is very much that of the theatre.
Vad ser du?
Den lyser.
Just precis. Men ingen vet varför den är självlysande. Ingen kan förklara det. Det obegripliga gör människor ursinniga.
There's Bergman speaking, spelling out the relationship between the entertainer and his audience. And often in his films we have a frame composition like this, with one person looking to the right and one looking almost full face into the camera, and the one looking full face is usually lecturing the other. One has a feeling that it's Alexander who wills a mummy to turn its head, when in reality it's probably Aaron manipulating some lever under the table. But it's nicely rhymed with Elsa's ominous movement towards the light. One feels Alexander wants the mummy to move, just as he wanted the statue to move its arm in the opening sequence. And so, by extension, Alexander is, through sheer force of will, unleashing the horrific finale.
Han säger att minsta sten har eget liv.
This dialogue all echoes E.T.A. Hoffmann and represents the beliefs and works of E.T.A. Hoffmann. The belief in the supernatural, in poltergeists and demons, and the notion that every pebble has a life of its own.
Om det finns en gud så är han en skit- och pissgud som jag skulle ha lust att sparka i röven.
And this is Bergman's alter ego chipping in with his own scatological words. Bergman has always liked to use this kind of language in private, if not so much on screen.
Ismael. Jag är här med din frukost.
And now, just before we meet the compelling character of Ishmael, Bergman will return us to the bishop, who realizes that he's been drugged by Emily.
Emily!
Jag fick en ask brompulver av din syster eftersom jag var sömnlös. Jag hade lagt 3 pulver i buljongen. Det var inte min avsikt att du skulle dricka det.
This is Emily finally exacting revenge on a man who would have been her nemesis. She presents a striking figure, made up to look almost like a corpse, and yet carrying within her the baby that will survive these terrible moments.
Jag går tillbaka till mina barn. Till mitt hem. Och min familj.
The bishop tries to vomit, and does so with a movement across the room that I've seen Bergman use on the stage on 2 or 3 occasions. The way that Jan Malmsjö lurches back to the bed from the wall is very theatrical, very particular to Bergman. The hieratic gestures, the heightened, exaggerated movement of the arms, the expression on the face. But it works because this is melodrama at its best.
Jag kommer aldrig tillbaka.
Jag ska förgifta ditt liv. Jag ska följa dig från stadsytan. Jag ska förstöra dina barns framtid.
Stackars Edvard. Du vet inte längre vad du säger.
Jag är vaken. Fruktansvärt vaken.
With horror, Emily realizes that he may well die and not just go into a deep sleep. And suddenly she's worried herself. And indeed that mask has been well and truly torn from the face of the bishop. He's as helpless as Vergerus, his namesake, was in that attic back in 1958 in The Magician, when he'd lost his spectacles and was reduced to a similar state of blindness.
Ismael, jag är här med din frukost.
And now, finally, the figure of Ishmael will be revealed. Ishmael is the most fascinating, some would say baffling, character in the film. He is played by a woman, Stina Ekblad, and so has an androgynous aspect that adds a certain tension to his scene with Alexander. In his diary for June 5, 1979, Bergman comments on Ishmael as follows. It's dangerous to invoke the infernal powers. In Isaac's house lives an idiot with the face of an angel, a thin, fragile body, and colourless eyes that see everything. He is able to do evil. He is like a membrane for wishes that quivers at the slightest touch, unquote. We know from the scenes with his dead father that Alexander has the gift of second sight, that he's in touch with a parallel dimension that can defy nature, just as Isaac can create the vision of the children lying on the attic floor when the bishop tears open the door, even though they're safely in that chest downstairs at that precise moment.
Hans hand ska vara mot var mans hand och var mans hand mot honom.
Stina Ekblad is a Swedish-speaking actress born in Finland, and her striking features have distinguished a variety of films from Scandinavia. She played the writer Agnes von Krusenstjerna in Maj Zetterling's Amorosa. She had an important role in Bo Widerberg's The Serpent's Way, and she played Eva in Liv Ullmann's Faithless in 2001.
Läs nu vad du själv har skrivit. Det står Ismael Rättsinsky.
It's interesting that Bergman should have invoked a biblical figure to bring about the fall of God's representative, the bishop. In the Old Testament, Ishmael was a rather disreputable character in the eyes of his contemporaries because he was the son of Abraham and his wife's slave girl. And Abraham's wife, Sarah, always disliked Ishmael, especially when he started to mock Isaac, her own son, whom she loved so much. So Ishmael was banished to the desert with Hagar and grew up in the wilderness, became an expert with the bow, and, according to the book of Genesis, he was not abandoned by God. So Ishmael represents the outsider, the child of God, who is nevertheless beyond the bounds of conventional society. Perhaps that's the position that Bergman felt he was in once.
Du är en besynnerlig liten person, Alexander. Du vill inte tala om det som du hela tiden tänker.
Here too, in the gesture of the hands clasping each other, we have a reference to persona, where Bergman describes the transference of personality between two women, of similar looks, between Bibi Andersson and Liv Ullmann, and they come close to each other in exactly this kind of composition. Across a table, they merge with each other.
En reslig man med ljust gråsprängt hår. Rätta mig om jag har fel. Han är blåögd. Klara blå ögon och ett kossaktigt ansikte. Rätta mig om jag har fel.
Thus, from Ishmael, Alexander somehow derives a demonic power that enables him to project sufficient energy of hate to trigger the final conflagration. There's also the subliminal suggestion that Ishmael and Elsa may be on the same wavelength. After all, both are treated as almost handicapped outsiders in their respective homes. Perhaps Ishmael is communicating Alexander's subconscious desire to kill the bishop, and Elsa picks up on that wish and gropes for the lamp, yet without quite knowing what will result.
Ska du inte tveka? Han sover tungt, plågad av mardrömmar.
If there's a hint of seduction here, it's only a hint. What is suggested much more palpably is the idea that Alexander has to give himself to the demons as a price for eliminating the bishop, and that all his life he'll pay that price. And if you want a metaphor, I think it's that Ingmar Bergman himself, in order to expunge his terrible childhood, has had to spend the rest of his life dealing with the so-called demons and exorcising them through his work. It could also be argued that Alexander must abandon himself utterly, nakedly to the supernatural in order to destroy his family's mortal foe.
Solen har just gått upp. Dörrarna slås upp. Nej, vänta.
The scenes of Elsa being consumed by flames went horribly wrong. The stunt double was set ablaze just before Bergman and Sven Nykvist had fixed the camera setup. And so the only solution was to use the footage that had been shot by the crew of the Making of documentary. We damn near burned down the studio, Bergman confessed with a great roar of laughter when I spoke to him on the set later. Now there's quite a bold cut, because we go to the penultimate sequence, which shows Emily in her mother-in-law's home, and the police arriving to inform her of the death of the bishop. But by some magic alchemy once again, some extrasensory perception that she and Alexander share, Emily seems to know in advance and is already dressed in mourning.
Polisen är här, vill absolut tala med dig.
Er make, hans högvördighet biskopen.
These two characters seem to have strayed directly from the pages of Charles Dickens, with their pompous dress and manners. At the same time, there's a whiff of Hitchcock in this climax. This calmness after the hideous death of Elsa and the bishop. As at the end of Psycho, when the psychiatrist explains how and why Norman Bates resorted to killing, so this policeman takes delight in pontificating and elaborating on the circumstances of the tragedy.
Brinnande som en fackla har den sjuka rusat genom huset och av en händelse tagit sig in i hans högvördighet biskopens sängkammare. Enligt hans högvördighet syster, fröken Henrietta Vergerus.
Notice these names: Lobelius, Vergerus, Bergius. In the Middle Ages, anyone in Sweden bearing a name ending in IUS belonged to the elite, the highly educated classes that included the clergy, and who were regarded as wielding intellectual authority. They are therefore treated with some suspicion by Bergman, and that's why he uses that suffix IUS so often for characters who sneer at ordinary mortals.
Gamla fru Vergerus fann sin son med sönderbränd underkropp och förkolnat ansikte.
The bishop has come to a similarly gruesome end, in that mercifully brief shot, to Raval, the seminarist in the Seventh Seal, who pleads for mercy and water in the forest just before dying from the plague in a terrible frenzy.
Av fru Vergerus, givna sömnmedlet möjligen förvärrade olyckan, kan jag heller inte fästa något allvarligare avseende därvid. Utan måste jag karaktärisera det inträffade som ett ohyggligt sammanträffande av särdeles olyckliga omständigheter.
And so to the epilogue, the final sequence of the film, when we recover again the happiness of the original Ekdal family and everyone is assembled, with Emily's baby and Mai's baby safely installed in their cribs behind the table. This speech is in a way a summing up of Bergman's own career.
Jag är fruktansvärt rörd.
It's a lot more tearful, a lot more sentimental, things the director hates. But there is some wisdom at the base of what Gustav Adolf is talking about that does appeal to Bergman. And first of all, it's the notion that he lives in a small world, and his range, in his eyes, is very limited. I think I may have told the joke about Chopin on another disc, but it's quite apt at this point. Anyway, Bergman once told me that after a gala concert in Paris, an elegant woman approached Chopin and asked him why, instead of turning out all those wonderful waltzes and nocturnes, he didn't try his hand at an opera or a symphony. "Madame," replied the composer, "my kingdom is a small one, but at least I am king there." This, of course, is what Gustav Adolf is enunciating also.
Den ska vi hålla oss till. Den ska vi odla och göra det bästa utav. Plötsligt drabbar döden.
Bergman has his tongue slyly in his cheek when he refers to death and the dramatic storms and depressing troughs of life. But he feels that the solution lies in not dwelling on such calamities. In this lovely panning shot, going almost right around the table, Sven Nykvist follows Jarl Kulla from one family member to another. Bergman has done so many different things that it's nice to have this summing up. If we look back on that remarkable career, well over 40 feature films and TV movies, scores of stage productions, operas, and of course screenplays for films directed by others, both at the start and the end of his career. And this is a personal pat one feels for Gunnar Björnstrand from the director himself. Bergman's output covers the full range of comedy and tragedy. He's dealt with guilt and expiation, faith and the absence of faith. But at the end of the day, his theatre troupe, his actors and actresses, his fellow entertainers are what counts, possibly even more than his own family issues. Love and entertainment, I'd suggest, are the two essential pillars of Ingmar Bergman's world. If you can entertain the public, then you don't need to wear the name artist on your sleeve. It's sufficient to have diverted the audience from the dark abyss for a few minutes or a few hours. And if you've loved, then you've experienced the best that life has to offer. In 1982, Bergman declared that he would never again make a film for the cinema. "I sense that my body doesn't want it anymore," he said. Suddenly, towards evening, at 4 o'clock, I'm tired to death. My body is tired and it hurts, and you realize these are signals, warnings to take it easy. For me, you see, film isn't just a spiritual matter. It isn't just a question of creativity and spiritual power alone. It's also, to a great extent, a physical matter, at least with the kind of craftsmanship I put into films." Unquote.
Ja, nu mina kära, mina älskade vänner, nu har jag pratat slut och ni får ta det för vad ni vill.
Of course, many people prefer the towering peaks of Bergman's career, The Seventh Seal, Wild Strawberries, or maybe Persona, or even Scenes from a Marriage. But this film reached Bergman's widest audience around the world and received applause, I think, because people could identify with it. Much of Bergman's work over the years has been rather too chilly for a general public. It's lacked humour, it's lacked that essential earthiness with which people like to identify. Not so Fanny and Alexander. It's nice when he takes Mai's daughter out of her crib and looks at her and speaks to her with such passionate, paternal tenderness. Something unique in the whole of Bergman's work. Children just haven't figured in his world. All right, there's a small boy in The Silence, and at the beginning and end of Persona, and now there's been Alexander. But until this film, children just haven't been so important. It's as though, as he entered his 60s, Bergman began to see life in a longer and richer perspective. This is a first glimpse of Lena Orlin. She is the daughter of Stig Orlin, who played a schoolboy in Torment, and then Bergman's alter ego in some of his earliest works. His daughter studied under Bergman at the Royal Dramatic Theatre School in Stockholm, and had bit parts in Face to Face, and also in Vilgot Sherman's film Taboo. In 1983, Bergman gave her a much bigger part in his TV movie After the Rehearsal, and she's developed into a very compelling actress. I think her finest characterization was as Sabina in The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Who can forget her performance there?
Emily vill säkert ha ett glas champagne och så ska vi skåla för våra döttrar.
Now Bergman is tying up all the loose ends.
Jag är så helvetes.
We're together again, says Gustav Adolf. They need to find Emily a husband in due course, or at least that's how things would have gone a century ago. But she is indeed back in the bosom of her family. And Gustav Adolf is absurdly content because he has his tolerant, some would say complaisant, wife to look after him. And he's also had a daughter by Maj.
Tycker du inte att jag har världens bästa hustru?
Mycket bättre än du förtjänar.
It's a pity, really, that Bergman cut out that long scene when Gustav Adolf and his brother faced down the bishop in the bishop's own home. It's a wonderful sequence because it gives these final meandering thoughts by Gustav Adolf a sharper profile. We can see that he's no idiot underneath all his bluster. Karl, his older brother, doesn't reappear during this epilogue, but one assumes that he too will live out his days in an uneasy climate of storm and sunlit intervals with his German wife. Maj is living up to the tradition of Bergman's best women, in that she's determined to go her own way.
Vad vill ni så här sent?
Vi vill flytta till Stockholm. Marianne Egerman ska starta modeaffär och vill att vi ska komma och hjälpa henne.
Och det vill vi så gärna.
Ja, förfärligt gärna faktiskt.
Bergman may hate his own women if they go off and shine in an independent life far from his orbit. But as an artist, he admires enormously the independence of women. He's created so many of them, whether it's Harriet Anderson's Monica, or her bareback rider in Sawdust and Tinsel, or Eva Dahlbeck's prima donna in Smiles of a Summer Night, or, most ambivalently, Ingrid Bergman's pianist in Autumn Sonata. And unlike the great playwright August Strindberg, whom he resembles so much, Bergman has never been a misogynist. He really does love women, and he really does understand them better than he does most men.
Gå och lägg er nu, jag ska tala med farmor.
So, like actors leaving a stage, one by one the characters who've become so familiar to us go out through doors. Gustav Adolf, and now Maj. Alexander, too, seems to be vanishing. This little scene that's coming up doesn't even appear in the published screenplay for Fanny and Alexander.
Helena.
Emily, så trevligt. Välkommen.
Jag vill rådgöra med dig.
But there's one more surprise up Bergman's sleeve. He likes to end his stage productions with a frisson, a coup de théâtre that grabs the audience by the throat for one last moment. Alexander seems happy enough as he munches his cookies. But suddenly, this dark figure looms behind him. And it's the cross in close-up that Bergman is maliciously emphasizing. Perhaps the notion that he can never escape this stern Lutheran upbringing that he had.
Mig slipper du inte.
And that those religious preoccupations will always haunt him.
En sak till.
Ja, du har fullkomligt rätt. Oscar bad dig på sin dödsbädd att ta hand om teatern.
And Emily will find herself talking not so much about Maj's plans to go to Stockholm as her own rekindled belief in managing the family theatre. This was a prediction of what would happen in real life, because Bergman would retire from the cinema after Fanny and Alexander and go back to the theatre. And between 1983 and 2000, he directed some 20-odd productions on stage in Stockholm.
Jag skulle önska att du läste ett nytt teaterstycke av August Strindberg.
Uff, den där otäcka kvinnohataren. Nej, vet du vad?
Stycket heter Ett drömspel.
Jaha. No.
Jag tänkte att vi båda skulle spela.
Of course, Strindberg was regarded by women as beyond the pale at that time. The playwright would die in 1912 after a private life even more turbulent than Bergman's. he had a first marriage filled with sound and fury to a budding actress named Siri von Essen. That lasted 14 years, and then he had a second marriage which collapsed after just 1 year to an Austrian journalist. His final alliance was with a Norwegian actress, Harriet Bosse, some 30 years his junior. Bergman shares with Strindberg a terrible gift for the most waspish arguments between men and women. Strindberg told his second wife that a bad marriage is better than none at all. It's a line very similar to the one Bergman dwells on in Thirst, hell together is better than hell alone. The theme of the couple chained together in misery is common to both men's work. Yet another theme linking Strindberg and Bergman is that of the vampire tendency in the artist himself, feeding off those who he knows most intimately to nurture his art.
Allt kan ske, allt möjligt och sannolikt. Tid och rum existerar icke.
Now she will read to Alexander one of the most famous passages from A Dream Play. Bergman has surely chosen it because it sums up for him the delicate balance in which reality and fantasy are held in his art, in his craft. As he told me when we met at the Royal Dramatic Theatre in 1969, my films are never meant to be reality. They are mirrors, fragments of reality, almost like dreams. And he held true to that principle.